Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still get goosebumps thinking about October 24th, 2009. It's been 14 years, and I've never heard anything like it since. I'm not the type to believe in monsters or supernatural stuff. I'm pretty practical about most things. But what happened that morning? It changed something in me. I was out waterfowl hunting with my buddy and his dad on Monroe Lake in southern Indiana. We'd been planning this trip for weeks. I remember checking my gear the night before, my Remington shotgun, shells, waders, calls, everything laid out on my bedroom floor. Got barely any sleep because I was excited like a kid before Christmas. We met up around 4 in the morning. It was pitch black, that deep darkness you only get in rural areas, with just a hint of frost in the air. The stars were incredible that night. We loaded up the small aluminum boat with our gear, voices hushed in the pre-dawn quiet, and headed out to this peninsula my buddy's dad knew about. It juts out into the lake with small bays on both sides, a perfect spot for ducks to come in. We set everything up in the dark, decoys bobbing in the water, finding our spots among some natural cover, checking our shooting lanes, the kind of routine that's second nature if you've hunted before. The three of us spaced out in a line along the shore, maybe 15 feet between each of us. Me in the middle, my buddy on my left, and his dad on my right. Then we waited for legal shooting light, that magical time just before sunrise, when the world starts to wake up. I remember putting in my earplugs, those orange foam ones you roll between your fingers, because my buddy's dad was known for shooting first and asking questions later, and I didn't want my ears ringing all day. As the sun started coming up, I noticed something odd. Usually, dawn is when everything comes alive. Birds calling, small animals rustling around, fish jumping in the water. But that morning was different. It was empty. No wood ducks whistling overhead, no geese honking in the distance. Even the usual songbirds were silent. Just the soft lapping of water against the shore. I figured maybe it was just a slow morning, or perhaps the weather pattern had affected the migration. But looking back, I should have realized something was off. About an hour after sunrise, I was getting antsy from the lack of action. The lake surface was like glass, reflecting the sky perfectly. I remember staring at the water, watching ripples from a distant fish spreading out in perfect circles. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was a dog barking. Even with my earplugs in, I could hear it coming from the right bay. I turned my head to look, thinking maybe someone had brought their hunting dog to the far shore, but then it changed. That's the only way I can describe it. It morphed from something recognizable into something I've never heard before or since. It became this deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from something massive. It started high and then dropped several octaves, ending in this low, rumbling growl that I could feel in my chest. The whole thing lasted maybe 8 to 10 seconds. I can't emphasize enough how loud it was, even through my earplugs. It was deafening, like someone had cranked a subwoofer to maximum volume right next to my ear. I yanked my earplugs out and jumped to my feet, nearly tripping over my blind. My buddy and his dad were already standing, shotguns half raised, scanning the shoreline. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My buddy's dad just shook his head, his eyes never stopping their scan of the tree line. My friend looked pale, like he might throw up. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes, searching the opposite shoreline, but all I could see was a beaver swimming across the bay, slapping its tail occasionally. Nothing else moved. Then we heard it again. Same sound, same pattern. Starting like a bark, morphing into that ungodly roar, then dropping to a growl. But this time it was farther away, like whatever made it had moved deeper into the woods. After that second roar, we huddled together and had a whispered conversation about what it could be. Black bear? No way. Not in Indiana, and bears don't sound like that anyway. Coyote? Nope. We all knew what coyotes sound like. Mountain lion? Possibly, but the sound was too deep, too powerful. We decided to stick it out, thinking maybe it was just some weird anomaly, but the hunting day was ruined. We were too keyed up, too alert to whatever might be in those woods to focus on watching for ducks. I remember holding my shotgun tighter than usual, constantly glancing over my shoulder at the tree line behind us. Around 11, we called it quits. Packed up our gear in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The boat ride back was quiet too. None of us wanted to be the first to say what we were all thinking. Later that afternoon, we were at my buddy's house, still rattled by what happened. His dad was on the computer, and we started searching for animal sounds online. Black bears, cougars, even elk and moose, though they're not found in Indiana. Nothing matched. Then his dad typed Bigfoot sounds into YouTube. I remember we all kind of chuckled nervously like, yeah, right. I'd always thought Bigfoot was complete nonsense, something for conspiracy theorists and attention seekers. He clicked on the first video, and when the audio started playing, I literally got chills down my spine. My buddy's eyes went wide, and his dad just sat back in his chair. It was identical to what we'd heard that morning. That same progression from barking to roaring to growling, the same timbre, the same pitch changes, the same everything. We spent the next few hours going down a rabbit hole of Bigfoot recordings, reports from Monroe County, discussions about whether these creatures might be real. Before that morning, we would have laughed at anyone who believed in such things. But suddenly, we weren't laughing anymore. I've always been a skeptic. I'm still not fully convinced that Bigfoot exists. But I am 100% certain that whatever made that sound that morning was not a normal animal. It wasn't anything I recognized, and I've spent my whole life outdoors. We went back to that same peninsula the following October, same setup, same time of day. But we didn't hear anything unusual. We looked for tracks or signs along the shoreline where the sound had come from, but found nothing conclusive, just some broken branches and what might have been a large footprint in the mud, though it was too distorted to be sure. I've told this story to a few close friends over the years. Some believe me, some don't. My wife thinks I heard a bear that had wandered far from its territory. My dad suggested it might have been some kind of military training exercise with unfamiliar equipment, but I know what I heard. The thing that sticks with me the most is how quiet everything was that morning, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Like every creature out there knew something was wrong, something was different, something was there that shouldn't be. I don't know if what we heard was actually a Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. Maybe it's some undiscovered species, or maybe there's some scientific explanation I just don't understand. But I do know that I heard something that doesn't fit into my understanding of the world, and that's a strange feeling to carry around. I haven't been back to that specific spot since, not out of fear exactly, but more out of respect. That peninsula feels like it belongs to something else now, something that was there long before humans started hunting ducks on that lake. Sometimes, when I'm in the woods alone now, I catch myself listening more carefully, looking a little deeper into the shadows between the trees. Not because I'm afraid of finding something, but because I'm afraid of missing something important. I don't mock Bigfoot believers anymore. I can't. Because for 8 to 10 seconds on an otherwise ordinary October morning, I heard something that shook my certainty about what does and doesn't exist in this world. And once that certainty is gone, it's hard to get it back. I still hunt, still spend as much time outdoors as I can. But now I go with a little more humility, a little more awareness that the natural world might contain things I don't understand and can't explain. Things that make sounds that stick with you for 14 years and counting. Whatever it was that made that sound on Monroe Lake, It's still out there, and sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder if it remembers us too. Story 2. I never thought I'd be one of those people. You know the type. Folks claiming they've seen strange creatures in the woods that science says don't exist. But after what I've experienced over the years here in Missouri, I don't care what anyone thinks anymore. I know what I've seen. My first encounter happened back in either 91 or 92. I was driving home late at night on one of those winding country roads we have all over rural Missouri. It was probably around midnight, pitch black except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. I was about 20 minutes from home when I caught something in my beams. Eye shine like you'd see from a deer, except it was way too high off the ground. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was just a weird reflection or something. That's when I saw it. Standing right at the edge of the road was this massive reddish-brown thing. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. I'm not exaggerating. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and I'd guess it weighed around 800 pounds. The body was covered in this shaggy hair or fur. When my headlights hit it directly, the creature threw its arms up to shield its face, like the light hurt its eyes. It happened so fast. Before I could even process what I was seeing, it turned and disappeared into the tree line with shocking speed for something so huge. I sat there in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't tell many people about what happened. Who would believe me? But I knew what I saw wasn't a bear or any other animal native to Missouri. Fast forward a few years, by some weird coincidence or maybe fate, I ended up buying property just 7 miles from where I'd had that sighting. It's a beautiful piece of land, 120 acres with woods, some clearings, and plenty of privacy. My mother moved into a trailer on the property while I built my own house on another section of the land. The first couple of years were mostly uneventful, but there were noises, strange sounds at night that I couldn't identify, not normal wildlife sounds. I know what coyotes, owls, and foxes sound like. These were different. Sometimes it would be weird whooping calls that seemed to come from different directions, like they were communicating. Other times it would be bizarre screams that made the hair on my arms stand up. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some animal I wasn't familiar with, but deep down, I knew better. Then one night, about 3 years after moving in, I let my dog out for his final bathroom break around 3 in the morning. I was standing on my back porch in my pajamas, waiting for him to do his business, when I heard it. From the dense woods about 200 yards from my house came this long, drawn-out howl that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It was deeper, more powerful, and it had this almost intentional quality to it, like a warning. My dog froze, hackles raised, and then bolted back to the porch. I'm not ashamed to admit I ran inside behind him, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Around this same time, my mother started telling me about strange things happening at her trailer. She'd wake up to loud banging on her walls in the middle of the night. At first, she thought it was raccoons, or maybe some local kids messing around, but it happened too often and too deliberately. Then the rock throwing started. My mom is in her 70s, but still active. She likes to keep her yard nice, and one day she was clearing rocks from her lawn area, tossing them toward the tree line about 30 yards away. She said she heard a rustling sound, and then one of the rocks came sailing back out of the woods and landed near her feet. She thought it was strange, but figured it might have hit something and bounced back. But then it happened again, and again. Someone or something in those woods was throwing the rocks back at her. I experienced the same thing a week later. I was weed-eating around her trailer, and I kicked some rocks toward the woods to get them out of the way. Next thing I know, one of them comes flying back and lands about 10 feet from me. I shut off the weed-eater and stared at the tree line. Nothing moved, but I had the distinct feeling of being watched. The incident that really shook my mother happened on a summer night. Her trailer is about a quarter-mile from my house, separated by a small stand of trees. She called me the next morning, her voice trembling. "There's something out there that can talk," she said. She told me she'd been awakened by dogs barking, probably our neighbors' hunting dogs that sometimes run through our property. The barking was frantic, like they were excited or scared. Then she heard this deep, guttural sound that she described as a 900-pound gorilla that could talk. She couldn't make out words exactly, but said it had the cadence and inflection of speech. After this sound, the dogs went completely silent, not gradually quiet, immediately silent, like they'd been commanded or frightened into stopping. I tried to convince myself there was some rational explanation, but the activity was increasing around my house too. I'd hear heavy footsteps on my porch at night, but when I'd check, nothing would be there. Rocks would hit my roof or walls, usually after dark, but sometimes in broad daylight. And then there were the wood knocks, sharp, deliberate knocking sounds that would come from different directions in the woods, like something was signaling. My husband initially thought I was just being jumpy or letting my imagination run wild. That changed when he was coming back from checking our barn one evening just before sunset. He came rushing into the house, pale-faced and out of breath. "I saw something," was all he could say at first. When he calmed down, he described seeing a massive figure move from one tree line to another near our barn. It wasn't a bear. It moved upright and with purpose, and it was fast, too fast for something so big. After that, he started finding footprints, huge impressions in the soft ground around our property that were clearly foot-shaped, but much larger than any humans. For a long time, we just lived with it. What else could we do? We didn't feel threatened exactly. Whatever this thing was, it seemed more curious than aggressive. It was like it was studying us, learning our patterns. We'd hear it circling the house at night sometimes, moving from window to window. I'd catch glimpses of something large moving in the tree line at dusk. Sometimes we'd find strange arrangements of sticks or rocks that definitely weren't there the day before. Then, about 4 years ago, my husband bought a night vision scope. We'd been hearing activity around the house for several nights in a row, and he wanted to see what was out there. We sat in the dark on our back porch, scanning the tree line. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Then my husband grabbed my arm and silently handed me the scope, pointing toward a specific spot about 50 yards into the woods. I looked through it, and my blood ran cold. Standing partially hidden behind a large oak tree was a creature exactly like the one I'd seen years before on that dark road. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, and watching our house intently. Its arms hung down past its knees, slightly curved like a monkey's. The head had a slight conical shape, almost like a crown or crest. As we watched it, something else, we couldn't see what, threw a rock that landed with a clatter in our carport. The creature in the trees didn't move at all, didn't even turn toward the sound. That's when I realized there had to be at least 2 of them. We watched it for maybe 5 minutes before it simply turned and walked deeper into the forest, moving with surprising grace for something so large. My husband and I didn't speak for a long time after that. What could we say? We'd just confirmed what I'd suspected for years. We were sharing our property with Bigfoot. Since that night, I've seen the creature 3 more times. Once was at our pond in the early morning fog. Another time, it was crossing a clearing at the edge of our property at dusk. The most recent sighting was just 2 months ago, when I spotted it standing motionless among the trees during a full moon, its silhouette unmistakable against the night sky. The only time I've ever felt threatened was about a year ago. I was collecting firewood near the edge of our property when I heard a deep, rumbling growl from the dense underbrush not 20 feet away. It wasn't a warning bark like a dog might make. It was a sustained, vibrating sound that I felt as much as heard. I backed away slowly and left the wood where it was. I didn't go back to that spot for weeks. I don't know why these creatures are here or what they want. They've never directly threatened us, apart from that one growling incident. Sometimes I think they're just as curious about us as we are about them. Other times, I wonder if they're trying to communicate in their own way. I've lived with this bizarre situation for so long now that it's become almost normal. I still get startled sometimes when I hear knocking from the woods or find unexplained footprints, but mostly I've accepted that this is just part of living here. My property seems to be their territory too, and we've reached a kind of uneasy coexistence. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, multiple times now, but I know what's out there in my woods. I know what watches my house at night. And sometimes, when I hear those weird calls echoing through the trees, I wonder if they're trying to tell me something. Story 3. I've been wanting to get this off my chest for years now. I guess I just needed the right place to share it, with people who wouldn't automatically dismiss me as crazy. What happened to me back in the summer of '98 still gives me nightmares, and I've never been able to look at forests the same way since. I was 12 years old that summer when my parents decided I should experience summer camp. They thought it would be good for me to get out of my shell and make some friends. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea, but they had already paid the deposit, so off I went to Camp Whispering Pines near Nordag, Alberta. The first day wasn't too bad. We got assigned to cabins, met our counselors, and did all those awkward icebreaker activities where you have to tell everyone your name and one interesting fact about yourself. I remember lying and saying I could do a backflip because I couldn't think of anything actually interesting. Thank God nobody asked me to prove it. It was the second day when everything changed. Everything forever. We were playing this wide game after lunch. Basically, a giant game of capture the flag, but spread across the entire camp. Our counselor, this guy in his 20s with a perpetual sunburn, had divided us into 2 teams and gave us these colored bandanas to wear. I got stuck on the blue team. The rules were simple. Find the other team's flag hidden somewhere in the camp boundaries while protecting your own. I teamed up with 2 other boys from my cabin whose names I can't even remember now. They were nice enough, but we'd only known each other for a day. We headed toward the west side of camp, thinking the red team might have hidden their flag near the lake. The counselors had marked the camp boundaries with these orange ribbons tied to trees, and they'd lectured us extensively about not crossing them. We'd been searching for maybe 20 minutes when I realized I couldn't hear my teammates anymore. I stopped and called out their names, but there was no response. Just the sounds of the forest, birds, wind through the pines, distant voices from other parts of the camp. I wasn't immediately worried. The game was spread out over a pretty large area, and I figured we'd just gotten separated as we moved through the trees. I decided to make my way toward Pioneer Cabin, which was one of the landmarks we were using to navigate. The forest was pretty dense in places, with a carpet of pine needles that muffled my footsteps. It was warm for June in Alberta, probably around 75 degrees, and sunlight filtered through the trees in bright patches. I knew Webster Cabin was on the other side of a small ridge, so I figured if I could make it to Pioneer, I could reorient myself and maybe find my teammates. I started jogging, keeping my eyes peeled for any signs of the red team that might be hiding nearby. That's when I tripped. My foot caught on a fallen log, partially hidden by underbrush, and I went down hard, scraping my palms and knees on the rough ground. I remember feeling embarrassed, hoping nobody had seen me fall. I sat up, brushing dirt and pine needles from my hands, wincing at the sting of the scrapes. I was about to stand up when I felt it. A change in the air. It's hard to describe, but it was like the forest suddenly went quiet. Not completely silent. I could still hear distant sounds from camp, but the immediate area around me seemed to hold its breath. And there was this smell. Not overpowering, but definitely noticeable. Kind of musky and earthy, like wet dog mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something funky. I froze, still sitting on the ground, and slowly looked around. That's when I saw it. It was standing maybe 30 feet away, partially obscured by a large pine tree. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, so impossibly tall, at least 7 or 8 feet. It was covered in dark brown fur that hung in matted clumps from its massive frame, but it was the face that made my blood run cold. Its face was almost human, but wrong. The bone structure was incredibly wide, with a heavy brow ridge and deep-set eyes. Its nose was slightly extended and pinched at the end, not quite like a snout, but definitely not a human nose. And its mouth, God, its mouth, was wide and set in what looked like a grimace, revealing teeth that seemed too large for even that massive face. It was standing upright, one enormous hand, not a paw, a hand with fingers. Gripping the trunk of the tree it was partially behind. The fingers were long, with dirty nails that looked almost like claws. It was watching me. I'm certain of that. Its eyes were fixed on me with an intelligence that made the whole encounter even more terrifying. For a moment, probably only a few seconds, but it felt like hours, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was like my brain short-circuited, unable to process what I was seeing. This wasn't supposed to be real. This was the stuff of campfire stories, not something you actually encounter on a sunny afternoon at summer camp. Then my body remembered how to work, and I screamed. It wasn't a conscious decision. The scream just tore out of me, high-pitched and primal. I think that startled the creature as much as seeing it had startled me, because it immediately reacted. It didn't charge at me or roar or anything like that. Instead, it simply turned and walked away. Not quickly, not running, just deliberately moving deeper into the forest. Its gait was strange, fluid, but with an odd rolling motion to its shoulders. I watched as it disappeared among the trees, moving with a quietness that seemed impossible for something so large. I kept screaming. I couldn't stop. My eyes stayed fixed on the spot where it had been standing, half convinced it would reappear at any moment. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was another camper in a costume, but no costume could be that realistic, that tall. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but bears don't have faces like that, don't move like that. After what felt like forever but was probably only a minute or two, I finally managed to stop screaming. My throat felt raw. I scrambled to my feet, still staring at where the creature had been. I was shaking so badly I could barely stand, my knees threatening to give out beneath me. Then I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, in the opposite direction from where the creature had gone. I didn't care about the game anymore. I didn't care about finding my teammates. I just needed to get back to people, to safety, to anything normal. I don't remember much about that run. Just flashes of trees whipping past me, the sound of my own ragged breathing, the sting of branches slapping against my face and arms. I wasn't even sure I was heading in the right direction, but blind panic drove me forward. By some miracle, I emerged near Pioneer Cabin. There were other kids there, part of the game, looking confused as I burst from the trees, wild-eyed and gasping for breath. One of the counselors, a woman named Jen, I think, rushed over to me, asking what was wrong. I tried to tell her what I'd seen, but the words came out jumbled and hysterical. Big, in the woods, it was watching me, like a person, but not fur. I wasn't making sense, and I could see the concern on her face shifting to something else, not quite disbelief, but close. She sat me down on the steps of the cabin, got me some water, told me to breathe. The other kids were staring, whispering to each other. I heard one say something about me making it up to get attention. Another suggested I'd seen a bear and panicked. A third wondered if I was mental. When I finally calmed down enough to tell a coherent story, the counselor listened politely. But I could tell she didn't believe me. She suggested it was probably a bear. Or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me because of all the scary stories kids tell at camp. She promised they'd alert the rangers about a possible bear sighting. but her tone made it clear she thought I was either lying or severely mistaken. The rest of that day is a blur. I remember being taken to the nurse's station to treat the scrapes on my hands and knees. I remember overhearing the counselors talking in hushed tones, discussing whether they should call my parents. I remember how the other kids kept their distance, like my craziness might be contagious. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from the forest outside our cabin made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hold the silhouette of that creature. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to convince myself that maybe it really had been a bear or a person in a costume or a hallucination brought on by heat and excitement. But I knew what I saw. I saw a Bigfoot, standing there in broad daylight, watching me with those two intelligent eyes before calmly walking away as if encounters with humans were an everyday annoyance. The camp directors called my parents the next day. They didn't say I was making up stories, but they suggested I might be having a hard time adjusting and thought it might be best if I went home early. My parents drove up that afternoon to get me. I think they were annoyed at first, but when they saw how genuinely terrified I still was, they didn't push it. I never told them exactly what happened. I said I got scared in the woods and overreacted. It was easier that way. I didn't want to see that look of disbelief on their faces too. It's been 25 years, and I've never gone camping again. I've never gone hiking in dense forests. I avoid places like the one where I saw it. Sometimes I almost convince myself it wasn't real, that the counselor was right, and it was just my imagination or a bear. But then I remember the smell, the intelligence in those eyes, the way it moved, so deliberate, so aware, the almost human quality of its face, distorted though it was, and I know what I saw was real. I still can't explain it. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but it happened on a sunny afternoon in June of '98, and it changed me forever. Whatever it was, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species, it's out there. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night and the wind moves through the trees outside my window, I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 4. I've never been able to properly explain what happened to me and my cousins back in the summer of 2003. I was 11 then, and we were staying at my grandparents' place just outside Forks, Washington. If you've been there, you know the kind of dense green forest I'm talking about. Tall trees that block out most of the sunlight, undergrowth so thick you can barely see 10 feet ahead, the kind of woods that feel ancient and like they're watching you. It was mid-July and the weather was perfect, not too hot, but warm enough to be outside all day. My cousins Tyler and Megan were there too. Tyler was 12, always acting like he was in charge because he was the oldest. Megan was the youngest at 9, constantly trying to keep up with us. We'd been staying with our grandparents for about a week by then, and we'd fallen into this routine of spending most of the day playing in the woods behind their house. Their property backed right up to the Olympic National Forest. The house sat on this little cleared area, maybe an acre wide, with a well-maintained yard that gradually gave way to wilder brush and then the full-on forest. My grandfather had always told us not to go too deep into the trees, but we were kids, and too deep was a relative concept. That day started like any other. After breakfast, we headed out back while the adults did whatever boring adult things they did. We had this spot about 50 yards from the house, far enough to feel like an adventure, but close enough that we could still see the roof of the house if we looked back through the trees. We'd found this small clearing, maybe 15 feet across, where we'd been building what we called our fort for the past few days. It wasn't much, just some fallen branches we'd arranged in a circle, with a couple of flat rocks in the middle for sitting. We'd gathered pine cones, interesting-looking stones, and some wild berries, which my grandmother had strictly forbidden us from eating as our supplies. Tyler had even managed to sneak out one of Grandpa's old tarps to use as a roof. The clearing had this perfect fallen log on one side that we used as a bench. The ground was covered with those soft pine needles that make a great natural carpet. The whole place smelled like earth and sap. We were totally immersed in our own little world. I remember we had been there for maybe 2 hours that day. I was arranging stones in a pattern, while Tyler was trying to build a lean-to against a tree. Megan was collecting more pine cones for our ammunition stockpile in case of imaginary attacks. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the constant soft rustling of leaves overhead. And then everything changed. At first, it was just a feeling. You know that sensation when you suddenly realize you're being watched. The hair on my arms stood up before I even consciously registered anything wrong. Then I heard it. This deep, heavy breathing coming from just beyond the tree line on the far side of the clearing. It wasn't like an animal panting. It was slower, more deliberate, and much deeper than anything I'd heard before. I looked at Tyler, and he had frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the same spot where the sound was coming from. Megan hadn't noticed yet. She was still picking up pine cones with her back to us. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Tyler. He nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the tree line. "Something's there," he mouthed, and then it stepped out from between 2 massive fir trees. I still struggled to describe what I saw. It was tall, so tall that my first thought was that it must be a man on stilts or something. But no person could move that naturally at that height. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its shoulders were so wide, they practically filled the gap between the trees it emerged from. The entire body was covered in this dark brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like matted human hair, but all over its body. It hung in clumps in some places, especially around the shoulders and back. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging almost to its knees, ending in these massive hands that looked capable of uprooting small trees. But it was the face that I'll never forget. It wasn't an animal face, not exactly. It had this flat, wide nose and a heavy brow that shadowed its eyes. Those eyes, they were deep-set, dark, and unmistakably intelligent, and they were fixed directly on us. By this point, Megan had sensed our fear and turned around. She dropped her pine cones and made a small, frightened sound in her throat that wasn't quite a scream. The 3 of us were frozen in place, staring at this thing that shouldn't exist. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, it just stood there, watching us. Then it tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious. That small, human-like gesture somehow made the whole thing even more terrifying. I could smell it now. This powerful, musky odor carried on the breeze. It smelled like sweat and dirt and something rotting, all mixed together. Not like a dead animal, but like something that lived outdoors and never bathed. It took several steps forward, moving with this strange, fluid grace despite its size. Each footfall was heavy enough that I could feel the vibration through the ground. It stopped at the edge of our clearing, maybe 15 feet away from where we stood. It leaned forward slightly, and I could see its nostrils flare as it sniffed the air, the way it moved, the way it seemed to be assessing us. There was an intelligence there that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just some animal that had wandered into our play area. It knew we were there. It was studying us, and then it made a sound. It started as this deep, rumbling grunt from somewhere in its chest. The sound built until it turned into this loud bark that seemed to echo through the entire forest. It wasn't exactly aggressive, more like it was trying to communicate something, but the volume and power of that sound physically pushed against my chest. That's when Megan screamed. It was like her scream broke whatever spell had us frozen in place. Tyler grabbed her arm, and I remember him yelling, "Run!" Though I'm not sure I actually heard him over the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. We bolted. I've never run so fast in my life. We abandoned everything, the fort, the tarp, all of it, and just ran straight for the house. I remember the feeling of branches whipping against my face and arms, but I didn't slow down. None of us looked back. We just ran. I was aware of the others beside me, all of us crashing through the underbrush, gasping and sobbing. I kept thinking it was right behind us, that any second I'd feel those massive hands grab me from behind. The 50 yards back to the house felt like miles. As we broke out of the tree line into my grandparents' yard, I saw my grandfather standing on the back porch. He must have heard Megan's scream or the commotion we were making. He was holding a shotgun, something I had never seen him do before, and yelling for us to get inside. Get in the house, now! His voice had this urgency that only confirmed we were in real danger. We scrambled up the steps and passed him through the back door, where my grandmother was standing with a look of absolute terror on her face. Once we were inside, my grandfather backed in, keeping the gun pointed toward the forest. He slammed and locked the door behind him. We were all talking at once, trying to explain what we'd seen. I remember my grandmother hushing us, telling us to calm down while my grandfather went to check all the doors and windows. When we finally managed to tell a somewhat coherent version of what had happened, my grandfather's face went pale. He didn't dismiss us or tell us it was our imagination like I half expected. Instead, he sat down heavily in his armchair and just nodded. "Stay inside," was all he said. I went to the living room window that faced the backyard and the forest beyond, and that's when I saw it again. It was standing right at the edge of the trees, partially obscured but unmistakable. Even from that distance, I could tell it was looking directly at the house, at me. I called for my grandfather, but by the time he got to the window, the creature had slipped back into the shadows of the forest. It moved with surprising stealth, for something so large, there one moment and gone the next. We stayed inside for the rest of the day. My grandfather kept the shotgun nearby and checked the windows periodically. He made phone calls in a low voice that I couldn't quite hear. My grandmother tried to distract us with board games and cookies, but none of us could focus on anything. Every sound from outside made us jump. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, branches breaking, heavy footfalls. At one point, I swear I heard that same deep breathing right outside my window, but I was too terrified to look. The next morning, my grandfather went out to check the clearing where we'd been playing. He took the shotgun with him and told us all to stay in the house. When he came back about an hour later, his expression was grim. "Found your fort," he said quietly, and something else. He described finding large, human-like footprints with visible toes that circled the entire edge of the clearing. The prints were deeply impressed in the soft ground, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. They followed the perimeter of the clearing before heading back into the deeper forest. He showed us a plaster cast he'd made of one of the prints. It was massive, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide. There were 5 distinct toes, almost human-like but broader. "I don't want you playing in that part of the woods anymore," he told us. It wasn't a suggestion. We never did go back to that clearing. For the rest of our stay, we didn't venture beyond the maintained yard. Even then, I constantly felt like we were being watched from the tree line. My grandfather never directly told us what he thought we'd seen, but one night I overheard him talking to my grandmother. "Same thing the Peterson boy claimed he saw last summer," he was saying. "And those hunters back in '97. "Do you think it'll come closer to the house?" my grandmother asked. "No," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. "They usually keep their distance." "Usually" wasn't very reassuring. We left a week later to go home, and I never went that deep into those woods again during future visits. My cousins and I didn't talk much about what happened, not even among ourselves. It was like we had this unspoken agreement that discussing it somehow made it more real. It's been 20 years now, and I still don't know what we saw that day. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in the Olympic Peninsula, and some descriptions match what we experienced. But reading about it and coming face to face with it are two completely different things. What I do know is that whatever it wasn't just a bear or some guy in a costume. The intelligence in those eyes, the way it moved, the sheer size of it. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist but does. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. In them, I'm back in that clearing, but I'm alone. And instead of running, I'm frozen in place as it comes closer and closer. I always wake up just as those long arms reach for me. Story 5. It's been nearly 30 years, but I still get chills thinking about what happened that October weekend in 1995. I've never been much for sharing personal stories online, but after reading similar accounts, I think it might help me process what I experienced. I was fishing with 2 buddies at Mono Creek Campground, about 13 miles above Huntington Lake in the Sierra Nevada. We'd planned this trip for weeks, knowing it was the last weekend before they closed the roads for winter. The weather forecast was decent, cold nights but sunny days, perfect for some late-season trout fishing. We arrived Friday afternoon and set up camp near the creek. The mountains were gorgeous that time of year, with patches of yellow aspen mixed with the deep green pines. The campground was nearly empty except for a couple of RVs at the far end. Most people had already packed it in for the season. Saturday morning we woke up early, made coffee over the campfire and grabbed our fishing gear. The plan was to work our way upstream, hitting different fishing holes. Mark, Doug and I had been fishing buddies for years, and we had a system. We'd leapfrog each other, spending 20 or 30 minutes at promising spots before moving on. By early afternoon, we'd caught a few decent rainbow trout. Nothing spectacular, but enough to make it worthwhile. Around 2 o'clock, Mark started complaining about being tired. He'd been fighting a cold all week and decided to head back to camp for a nap. Doug and I wanted to try a stretch further upstream that looked promising on our topo map. "You guys go ahead," Mark said, zipping up his jacket. "I'll catch up with you later if I'm feeling better." So Doug and I continued upstream, working the pools and riffles. The fishing was decent, and we were enjoying the solitude. The creek narrowed as we moved higher, cutting through a small canyon with steep slopes on either side. The terrain was getting rougher, with more boulders and fallen trees to navigate around. About 45 minutes after leaving Mark, we reached a beautiful section of the creek with a deep pool below a small waterfall. I decided to try my luck there, while Doug continued a bit further upstream. The spot was perfect, shaded by tall pines with plenty of cover for trout. I was completely focused on my fishing, watching my line drift through the current, when I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. Looking up, I saw Doug making his way back toward me along the bank. Something seemed off about how he was moving, almost stiff, with his eyes wide and fixed ahead. When he got within earshot, he didn't say a word, just motioned urgently for me to join him. His face was pale, and his hand was shaking as he waved me over. I immediately reeled in my line and walked toward him. "What's wrong?" I asked. He just shook his head and pointed upstream toward a small rocky outcropping. Just come look," he whispered. I followed him about 50 yards upstream to the edge of a small drop-off, where the creek tumbled down into another pool. As we approached, the first thing that hit me wasn't what I saw. It was what I smelled. I've spent my whole life outdoors. I've encountered bears, been downwind of elk in rut, stumbled across all kinds of dead animals. But this smell was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was overwhelmingly powerful and complex, musty and wet, like moldy leaves and wet dog fur, but with this intense animal musk that seemed to coat the inside of my nose and mouth. It wasn't just bad, it was disorienting. The closest comparison I can make is the time I accidentally disturbed a skunk den, but this was different, heavier, more primal. Doug grabbed my arm and pointed across the creek to the hillside opposite us. My eyes followed his finger, and that's when I saw it. Standing motionless on the slope, partially obscured by a cluster of small pines, was something. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as a bear standing on its hind legs. But within seconds, I knew that wasn't right. This thing was too tall, too proportioned like a human, but massively built. It stood perfectly still, about 25 yards away, watching us. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, towering over the smaller trees around it. Its body was covered in thick, shaggy hair, predominantly a reddish-brown color, with patches of darker, almost black hair mixed in, especially around its shoulders and head. Its face is what haunts me the most. It wasn't like an ape or a bear. It was almost human-like, with a prominent brow ridge and deep-set eyes. The eyes, they were dark but reflective, and they were fixed directly on us with unmistakable intelligence. For several seconds that felt like minutes. We just stared at each other in complete silence. The only sound was the rushing water of the creek. I felt rooted to the spot, not from fear, though I was certainly afraid, but from something else I couldn't explain. Then, without warning, the creature turned away from us. Instead of running, it began moving up the hillside with these enormous, deliberate strides. Each step covered what must have been 4 or 5 feet of ground. It moved with surprising grace for something so large, navigating the steep terrain with ease. My first instinct was to follow it, not to chase it, but just to keep it in sight, to confirm what I was seeing was real. I took a step forward to cross the creek, and that's when the strangest part of the whole encounter happened. My body wouldn't respond properly. It wasn't like being paralyzed with fear. I've experienced that before. This was different. I could move my head, my eyes, even my arms to some extent, but my legs felt impossibly heavy. When I tried to take another step, my movements were sluggish, like I was trying to walk through chest-deep mud. I glanced at Doug and saw the same bewildered expression on his face. He was trying to raise his arm to point, but the movement was slow and uncoordinated, like he was fighting against some invisible force. "I can't move right," he mumbled, his words slightly slurred. We stood there, struggling against this strange heaviness, watching helplessly as the creature reached the top of the ridge in what seemed like just a dozen long strides. It paused momentarily at the crest, its massive silhouette clearly visible against the blue sky, before disappearing over the other side. The moment it vanished from view, the heaviness started to lift. Within about 30 seconds, I could move normally again, though I felt drained, like I'd just run a mile at full sprint. Doug and I stood there in silence for a long time. I kept expecting him to say something first, to laugh nervously and suggest it was a bear, or maybe a guy in a suit playing a prank, but he didn't. He just stared at the ridge where the creature had disappeared, occasionally shaking his head. Finally, I broke the silence. What the hell was that? Doug just looked at me, his face still pale. "I don't know, but you saw it too, right?" I nodded. "Yeah, I saw it. And that smell. I smelled it. And the way we couldn't move right." I nodded again, like my body was suddenly made of concrete. We stood there a bit longer, both trying to process what had happened. Eventually, Doug suggested we head back to camp. Neither of us mentioned trying to follow the creature or investigate further. There was an unspoken understanding that we'd seen something we weren't supposed to see, and neither of us was eager to push our luck. The walk back to camp was surreal. We moved quickly, constantly scanning the slopes above us. We didn't talk much, just occasional comments about the path or obstacles in our way. It was like we both needed time to process what had happened before discussing it further. When we got back to camp, Mark was awake, tending the fire and looking bored. "Catch anything good?" he asked as we approached. "A few small ones," I replied automatically, avoiding eye contact. Doug and I silently agreed not to tell Mark what had happened. Not then, anyway. It wasn't that we didn't trust him. We just couldn't find the right words to describe what we'd seen without sounding completely insane. That night, around the campfire, Mark chatted about wanting to try a different spot tomorrow, while Doug and I were unusually quiet. I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was some hermit living in the mountains, but deep down I knew better. Later, after Mark went to his tent, Doug and I finally talked about it in hushed tones. That thing, It wasn't a bear, Doug said, staring into the dying embers of the fire. No, it wasn't. You don't think, people talk about Bigfoot and stuff, but I don't know what else it could have been, I admitted. It was standing upright, walking upright, moving like a person, but not. Doug nodded slowly. And that smell. Jesus, that smell. And the way we couldn't move right afterward, I added. That was the freakiest part. It felt like I was drugged or something, Doug said. Like I couldn't get my brain to connect with my body properly. For me, it was like everything was suddenly heavy, like I was trying to move through molasses. We speculated that the smell might have something to do with it. Some kind of defensive mechanism, maybe, like how skunks spray to keep predators away. But instead of making you run, this smell somehow impaired your ability to move or think clearly. It sounds crazy, I know, but that's the only explanation that makes any sense to me. We left the next morning, earlier than planned. Neither of us was keen on going back upstream, and Mark could tell something was off, though we still didn't tell him what had happened. It wasn't until weeks later, after the experience had time to settle, that Doug and I finally told him. He didn't believe us at first, thought we were pulling his leg, but he eventually realized we were serious. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that day. I've read accounts of other Bigfoot sightings, looking for similarities. Some reports mention the overwhelming smell. A few even describe the strange inability to move properly during encounters. It makes me wonder if there's something to it, some evolutionary defense mechanism these creatures have developed to avoid human contact. To this day, I don't know for sure what we saw. I'm not some Bigfoot enthusiast who went looking for evidence. I was just a guy fishing with his buddies who stumbled across something I can't explain. But I know what I saw, I know what I smelled, and I know how my body responded. I haven't been back to Mono Creek since then. Doug and I still fish together occasionally, but we tend to stick to more populated areas these days. Sometimes, when we're alone, one of us will bring up that day, and we'll spend a few minutes speculating about what we experienced, but we never reach any satisfying conclusions. All I know is that something was out there in those mountains, something that doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of the natural world. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering, if I had been able to move normally that day, would I have followed it? And if I had, would I have ever come back to tell the story? Story 6. I've been sitting here staring at my computer screen for 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to even begin this. My hands are still shaking a bit as I type this out. This happened back in February of 2006, but I swear to God, sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear those sounds again. My wife and I were living in this old farmhouse in Stevens County, Washington. It was one of those places that real estate agents call secluded and private, but what they really mean is isolated and nobody around for miles. Our nearest neighbor was about 2 miles down the road, and our house sat at the very end of this winding gravel driveway, surrounded by thick timber on 3 sides and an open pasture on the 4th. In the summer, it was beautiful. In the winter, it was like living in a Stephen King novel. That February was especially brutal. We'd had snow piling up for weeks, and the temperatures hadn't climbed above freezing in days, the kind of cold that makes everything brittle, where the trees crack in the night and the wind cuts right through you. It was around 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. My wife had already gone to bed. She had an early shift at the hospital the next morning, while I was still up reading a book by the wood stove in the living room. The stove was cranking out heat, making that occasional tick-tick sound as the metal expanded. Outside, it was pitch black and dead silent, the way it gets when snow blankets everything. The first thump was so subtle I almost didn't register it. It sounded like someone had tossed a snowball against the side of the house, just a dull, muffled impact somewhere on the east wall. I lowered my book and listened for a minute, figuring it was just snow sliding off a tree branch or something. Then it happened again, louder this time, not like a snowball, but like someone had taken the flat of their hand and smacked it hard against the siding. The wall near the window actually shook a little. I put my book down and stood up. My first thought was that maybe a deer had wandered up close to the house, possibly attracted by our garden under the snow. We'd had issues with them before, though they'd never actually bumped the house. I was about to go look out the window when something slammed against the roof directly overhead with enough force that I heard the ceiling joists groan. It wasn't like the sound of a branch falling. This was deliberate, like something had jumped onto our roof. I froze in place, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. Then came the footsteps. I've been a hunter my whole life. I know what animals sound like moving through the woods. I know the sound of deer, elk, moose, bear, all of it. What I heard walking across our roof wasn't any of those things. The footsteps were measured and deliberate, heavy, so goddamn heavy that the ceiling creaked with each step, and they were spaced like a person walking, not the scampering of a raccoon or the four-beat pattern of a deer. My wife came running into the living room in her pajamas, her face white with fear. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. I shook my head, unable to answer her. I was straining to track the sounds, trying to make sense of what was happening. The footsteps moved from one end of the roof to the other, slow and purposeful. That's when the windows started shaking. Not from wind or cold, they were being pushed like someone was testing them, seeing if they would give. I could actually see the glass flexing inward as whatever was outside pressed against them. The pressure would release, then move to another window, then another, working its way around the house methodically. "It's circling us," my wife whispered, clutching my arm so tightly her nails dug into my skin. The whole house seemed to come alive with noise, thuds against the siding, the roof groaning under heavy weight, windows rattling in their frames. It wasn't random. It felt coordinated, like whatever was out there was testing our defenses, looking for a way in. And then we heard it, a deep guttural growl right outside the living room window, so close I could feel the vibration in my chest. It started low and rose into something between a scream and a roar, a sound I've never heard before or since, not a bear, not a cougar, not anything I recognized. The window pane actually vibrated from the force of it. My wife was crying silently now, and I realized I'd backed us both up against the wood stove, as far from the windows as we could get in that room. "I need to see what it is," I said, though everything in my body was screaming at me not to. I edged toward the window where the sound had come from. The curtain was drawn, but there was a small gap at the edge. With my heart threatening to burst out of my chest, I reached out and pulled the curtain back just slightly. I'll never forget what I saw. A face was pressed against the glass, not 3 inches from mine. The eyes caught what little light came from our living room, reflecting a dull amber color, and they were fixed directly on the house, intelligent, aware. They sat beneath a heavy brow ridge that sloped back into what I can only describe as a massive skull. The nose was broad and flat, not like a human nose at all, and dark hair hung down across the sides of the face. The skin looked grey and rough in the dim light, stretched over huge cheekbones, but it was the mouth that haunts me, wide, wider than a human mouth should be, and drawn back to show teeth. The expression wasn't curious, it was furious. I jerked back from the window, letting the curtain fall. My wife saw my face and started to ask a question, but I clamped my hand over her mouth and shook my head violently. The pounding started again, heavier now, moving to the roof and then to the back door. Something slammed against the siding with enough force that dishes rattled in the kitchen cupboards. Another roar tore through the night, this one farther away, like it had moved to the edge of the pasture. And then something even stranger happened. The roof began to shake in a different pattern. Not like a single creature was up there, but as if multiple things were moving around. Their weight shifted in pairs, heavy thuds followed by lighter ones, as if they were working together. Something scraped along the siding with what sounded like claws or long nails. dragging from one wall to another. The sound set my teeth on edge, like fingernails on a chalkboard, but deeper, more powerful. "What do we do?" my wife mouthed silently. I didn't know. Our shotgun was in the closet of our bedroom, but I wasn't sure I could make it there without passing windows. And even if I got it, what then? I couldn't see enough to shoot anything, and I didn't know how many there were, or what they even were. So we stayed huddled by the wood stove, listening as our house was systematically assaulted from every side. This wasn't random animal behavior. This felt targeted, deliberate, like they were trying to terrify us, and they succeeded. For over an hour, this continued. Footsteps, pounding, scraping, occasional roars or screams that made the hair on my neck stand up, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. We sat frozen, straining to hear any sound at all. Minutes stretched into a half hour with nothing. No footsteps, no growls, not even the normal sounds of the forest at night. We didn't move until dawn began to lighten the sky. Even then, I made my wife stay inside while I grabbed the shotgun and went out to see what had happened. The snow around our house told the story. Dozens of tracks circled the building. Massive footprints pressed deep into the snow. I put my boot next to one for comparison and felt sick. Each print was at least 17 inches long and incredibly wide, with 5 clear toe impressions. They were clearly bipedal tracks, walking upright like a human would. But no human makes prints like that. Some tracks circled around to each window, where the snow was trampled down as if something had stood there for a long time. Others led to the back door, and still more crossed the yard to where the roof line met the ground at the lowest point. But the most disturbing evidence was on the siding itself. Deep parallel scratches were carved into the wood exactly where we'd heard that awful dragging sound. 4 lines running horizontally about 7 feet up from the ground. Whatever had made them had to be huge. We called the sheriff's department, but they just sent out a single deputy who looked at everything, took some pictures, and suggested it might have been kids playing pranks, or possibly a bear, though he couldn't explain the footprints. He promised to file a report, but I could tell he didn't believe us. For weeks afterward, we couldn't sleep properly. We kept the curtains drawn tight, and that loaded shotgun close at hand. We talked about moving, but the housing market was terrible, and we couldn't afford to just abandon the place. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that night. I've read everything I can find about wildlife in Washington state, about unexplained phenomena, about Sasquatch sightings, and I keep coming back to one conclusion. Whatever came to our farmhouse that night wasn't an animal, at least not in the conventional sense. It was bigger, stronger, and angrier than anything I'd ever encountered, and it wanted us to know it was there. We moved away 6 months later, and I've never gone back to Stevens County. I still can't explain what happened that night, but I know what I saw. Those eyes looking in at me through the window, they weren't just animal eyes. There was something behind them, something aware. Sometimes I still wake up in the dead of night, thinking I hear heavy footsteps on the roof, and I lie there in the dark, waiting for that first thump against the wall. Story 7. I never thought I'd be sharing this stuff with strangers, but it's been eating at me for years now, and I need to get it out. I've been hunting this big private leased land for a while, going on 3 years now. It's this beautiful mix of planted pine, hardwood ridges, and these eerie cypress swamps that connect right up to Ocala National Forest in Florida. At first it was just perfect hunting grounds, but now, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. It all started back in 2012 during archery season. I remember it clearly because it changed everything about how I view those woods. It was getting close to dusk, that perfect golden hour when deer usually start moving. I was up in my tree stand, about 18 feet off the ground, just waiting quietly like I'd done hundreds of times before. The sun was starting to fade, and I was thinking about packing it in when I heard it. This blood-curdling scream coming from the swamp area, not an animal sound I recognized, not a bobcat, not a fox, not anything I'd heard in my 20-plus years of hunting. It was loud and it was wrong. The hair on my arms stood up instantly. Before I could even process what I'd heard, there were these heavy footsteps, not deer, not hog, something big. And whatever it was, it started circling my position. I'm not talking about wandering around, I mean deliberately circling my tree stand. Around and around, I could hear the footfalls on the pine needles and fallen leaves, crushing them with what sounded like serious weight. My heart was pounding so hard, I swear whatever was down there must have heard it. Then, and this is what really got me, something large sailed through the timber above me, like something had been thrown, but big. Then a stone slammed into the trunk of my tree, just below where I was sitting. That's when I lost it. "Hey, I'm up here!" I yelled, thinking maybe it was some idiot hunter who somehow didn't see my blaze orange hat. But deep down, I knew better. The woods went dead silent. That unnatural silence when everything's holding its breath. I got down from that stand faster than I ever had before, practically sliding down the ladder sections. I didn't run, but I walked out of there at what you might call a very purposeful pace, checking over my shoulder every few steps. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just some local kids messing with hunters. But I couldn't explain that scream. It wasn't human, it wasn't any animal I knew, and whatever threw that object had some serious strength. After that, I started noticing a pattern. Everyone I took hunting on that property experienced something strange. My buddy Mike heard knocking sounds, like someone taking a baseball bat to a hollow tree. My cousin swore he heard branches being deliberately snapped just outside his flashlight's beam when he was walking out one night. My brother-in-law refused to go back after something howled so close to his stand that he said it made his chest vibrate. At first, I thought maybe we were all just feeding off each other's stories, getting spooked over nothing. But then, I had my first daylight sighting and everything changed. I was setting up a new tree stand about half a mile deeper into the property than I usually went. It was mid-morning, clear day, good visibility. I was securing the platform when I felt it, that feeling of being watched. You know that sensation? It's primal. I slowly turned my head toward a large cypress about 40 yards away, and there it was. It wasn't hiding exactly, more like observing. A massive, all-black figure standing behind the tree, but clearly visible to me from my angle. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. The shoulders were impossibly wide and thick, the torso barrel-like. Its proportions weren't right for a human. Too big, too powerful looking. We locked eyes for maybe 3 seconds, 3 of the longest seconds of my life, before it simply stepped back and seemed to melt into the background vegetation. I didn't run, I didn't yell, I just finished what I was doing with shaking hands and left, walking backward half the time. I told myself it could have been a bear standing upright, but I knew better. Bears don't peek around trees like that, they don't stand that tall, and they sure as hell don't move the way this thing did, deliberate, controlled, aware. I almost gave up the lease after that, almost. But there's something about that land. The hunting is just too good to walk away from. So I kept going back, but never alone into the deeper parts anymore. The second sighting happened about 7 months later. I was putting down some feed early in the morning, full daylight, about 8:30 a.m. I was walking along one of the game trails when I heard a shuffling in some thick brush to my right. I figured hog or deer and turned to look. What rose up out of that brush wasn't either. It stood up in one fluid motion. This massive black figure, 7 to 8 feet tall, easy, built like a professional linebacker, but bigger all over. It seemed as surprised to see me as I was to see it. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Then it turned and moved away from me with these long ground-covering strides, heading straight for the swamp. The way it moved was what got me. Not running exactly, but covering ground faster than any person could. Each step was like 4 of mine would be. No awkwardness, no stumbling despite the rough terrain. just this powerful, efficient movement. It disappeared into the cypress knees and standing water before I could even think to grab my phone for a picture. That second one looked remarkably similar to the first. Same size, same build, same coloring. That's why we started calling them the twins. I say we, because by this point, I'd told a few trusted hunting buddies about what I'd seen, and some of them had their own stories from the property. I'm not crazy. I'm not the kind of person who sees things. I'm a practical guy, work in construction, believe what I can touch and see. But what I've seen on that property defies explanation. These aren't bears. They move wrong, stand wrong, act wrong for bears. They're intelligent in a way that's unsettling. Over the next year, I started noticing patterns. The feed setups would be disturbed, but not like raccoons or deer would do it. The bags would be emptied, sometimes moved 50 yards from where I left them. Trail cameras would be tipped to face the sky or the ground, never broken, just adjusted. It was like they knew what the cameras were for. One time I found one of my smaller game cameras hanging from a branch about 12 feet off the ground. I'd secured it to a trunk only 4 feet up the day before. The strap wasn't broken. It had been carefully unbuckled and relocated. I started taking people out there at night specifically to try and replicate some of these experiences, not to hunt, just to listen and watch. Every single time, and I mean every time, we got something, knocks on hollow trees that would come in patterns of 3. Howls that cut through the night, nothing like coyotes or dogs, longer, deeper, more controlled. The sound of tree breaks that weren't just dead branches falling, but sounded like something with serious strength deliberately snapping saplings. One night, my buddy Jeff and I were sitting back to back at the edge of one of the cypress stands. We heard splashing in the water about 60 yards in, like something big was moving through the swamp. Then 3 distinct knocks, like someone hitting a tree with a hammer. Jeff called out, "Hello?" And immediately, we heard a perfect mimic come back. "Hello?" But deeper, raspier. Jeff nearly fell over backward into me. We left immediately. The weird thing is, I've noticed these encounters cluster around certain times, usually periods of low human activity in the area. After hunting season ends, during the middle of summer when it's too hot for most people to be out there, or during prolonged rainy periods when the trails get muddy and impassable for ATVs. It's like they know when they can move around with less chance of running into people. I've had multiple witnesses experience these things with me over several years now. People who came in skeptical and left shaken. My brother-in-law won't even drive down the access road to the property anymore after what he heard. My friend's teenage son caught a glimpse of something moving parallel to us through thick brush as we were leaving one evening. He described it exactly as I would have, tall, black, moving with purpose. I still hunt this land. I've accepted that these animals, creatures, whatever they are, they recognize human patterns. They know the routines of hunters. They choose to either ignore us or engage with us, depending on factors I can't begin to understand. The interactions don't feel threatening, more investigatory, like they're curious about what we're doing there. Last month, I found my tree stand. A heavy metal one, mind you, moved about 10 feet from where I'd secured it to a different tree. The straps were still buckled, just around a different trunk. The platform was still level, properly placed. This wasn't vandalism. This was something that understood the function of the stand and relocated it. Maybe for its own reasons. I don't know what to call them. I don't know what they are. But they're out there, watching, listening, learning our patterns. Sometimes I feel like they're studying us as much as we're trying to study them. The most unnerving part is their intelligence, the deliberate nature of their actions, the way they seem to communicate with each other across distances, the way they manipulate objects we leave behind. My most recent encounter was just last week. I was walking back to my truck at dusk when I heard something large moving parallel to me through the brush, matching my pace exactly. When I'd stop, it would stop. When I'd start walking again, so would it. Just before I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, I heard 3 quick knocks from the woods behind me, and then dead silence. I turned around, scanning the tree line, and for just a moment I swear I saw 2 sets of eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, about 7 feet off the ground, spaced about 30 yards apart. The twins, watching me leave their territory. Again, this story 8. I still get chills every time I think about what happened that morning. It's been 11 years now since that day in May of 2012, but I can recall every detail like it happened yesterday. Some memories just burn themselves into your brain, you know? This is one I wish I could forget. I've been fishing base tournaments all across the South for almost 30 years. Started when I was 18, and by my late 40s, I thought I'd seen everything these lakes could throw at me. Thunderstorms that came out of nowhere, boats breaking down miles from shore, even helped rescue a couple who'd capsized in rough water once. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on Lake Ouachita that morning, May 19th, 2012. The date is seared into my memory. Tournament season was in full swing, and I wanted to scout a secluded cove on the eastern side of the lake that had produced some monster base for me in previous years. I got up at 4 in the morning, loaded my gear, and drove the 40 minutes from my place to the boat ramp in the dark. I wanted to be on the water right at sunrise to hit that sweet morning bite. The weather was perfect, mid-60s, slight breeze, partly cloudy. One of those mornings where you thank God you're a fisherman. I launched my base boat and made the 15-minute ride to this little cove I'd come to think of as my spot. Not many people knew about it because it was a pain to access. You had to navigate through some shallow water and dodge a few submerged stumps. But that's what kept it relatively untouched. There was this old wooden dock there. Nobody maintained it anymore, but it was still solid enough to tie up to. I secured my boat and decided to fish from the dock instead of from the boat. Sometimes I just prefer feeling that connection to the shore, you know? Having my feet on something stable while I cast. The first hour was peaceful. I caught a couple decent 3-pounders on a Texas-rigged plastic worm, working it slow along the bottom near some fallen timber. The sun was fully up by then, casting that golden morning light across the water. Birds were calling, insects buzzing, that perfect symphony of nature that's like background music to any good fishing trip. Then everything changed. It happened so suddenly I actually thought my hearing had gone out. 1 second, the woods were alive with sound. The next, absolute silence. Not a bird, not a cricket, not even the sound of leaves rustling. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire world. That's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Any outdoorsman knows that when nature goes quiet, something's wrong. Usually it means a predator is nearby, a coyote, or maybe a bobcat. But this was different. The silence was complete, unnatural. I stopped reeling and scanned the shoreline, moving my head slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the dense tree line about 30 yards from the water's edge, same as always. Then I caught movement, just a slight shifting of something large behind a cluster of pine trees. I squinted, trying to get a better look, wondering if it was maybe a bear. We get black bears in Arkansas, and while they're usually shy, they can definitely send the wildlife into hiding. But then it stepped forward, and I knew instantly this was no bear. The creature emerged from between 2 tall pines, and my entire body went cold. It stood upright on 2 legs, impossibly tall. I'm 6 feet myself, and this thing towered over what I'd guess was 8 feet, maybe more. Its shoulders were broader than any human I'd ever seen, like a linebacker times 2. But it was the way it moved that made my stomach drop. Deliberate, purposeful. This wasn't an animal wandering aimlessly through the woods. It was walking with intention, and that intention seemed to be me. I couldn't move. My fishing rod hung limp in my hands as I stared. The thing was covered in thick hair, not fur exactly, but more like hair, dark brown with this strange reddish tint that caught the sunlight. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, ending in what looked like massive hands. The head is what finally broke my paralysis. It had this conical shape with a sloped forehead and a heavy brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. But those eyes, Jesus, they weren't animal eyes. They were deep set in that face, and they held an intelligence that sent ice through my veins, and they were fixed directly on me. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot my whole life. Hell, who hasn't? But I'd always laughed them off as tall tales or cases of mistaken identity. Nobody I respected had ever claimed to see one. But standing there on that dock, watching this creature watching me, I knew exactly what I was looking at. There was no other explanation that made sense. It took a step toward the water's edge, and that broke my trance. I started backing up toward the shore where my truck was parked, not wanting to turn my back on it. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. I kept thinking I should grab my phone and take a picture, but my body wasn't listening to those thoughts. All it wanted was to get away. The Bigfoot, because that's what it was, I don't care who believes me, stepped into the shallows. The water barely reached its knees. It kept its eyes locked on mine as it waded slowly but steadily toward the dock. Not rushing, not aggressive, but with this terrible purpose that was somehow worse than if it had charged. I reached the end of the dock and stumbled backward onto the shore, nearly falling. My tackle box, my expensive rod and reel, my catch for the morning, I abandoned all of it. Nothing mattered except getting to my truck. I fumbled with my keys, dropping them once before finally getting them into the ignition. Through the windshield, I could see it had reached the dock now. It stood at the end, water dripping from its lower half, just watching me. Not making a sound, not making any threatening moves, just watching with those eyes that seemed to see right through me. I cranked the engine and threw the truck into reverse so fast I nearly stalled it. Gravel sprayed as I backed onto the dirt road, then jammed it into drive. The last image I have is of that thing still standing motionless at the end of the dock, its massive silhouette framed against the morning sun, reflecting off the lake. I drove like a madman back to the main road, not even stopping at the boat ramp to pull my boat out of the water. I just left it tied to that dock, with my gear, with everything. I didn't care. I just needed distance between me and whatever that was. When I finally calmed down enough to think straight, I was already halfway home. I pulled over at a gas station, hands shaking so bad I could barely hold my coffee cup. Should I call someone? The game warden? The police? And say what? That Bigfoot stole my fishing spot? That I'd seen a monster that most people think is a myth? I sat there for almost an hour, trying to process what had happened. In the end, I called my buddy Mike, who worked for the Department of Natural Resources. I didn't tell him what I'd seen, just that I'd had to leave in a hurry and needed help getting my boat. He picked it up for me later that day, said my gear was still there, neatly stacked at the end of the dock. That detail still gives me goosebumps, the idea that it had gathered my things together. Mike asked what had spooked me so bad, and I mumbled something about thinking I'd seen a bear. He knew I was lying. We've known each other 30 years, but he didn't press it. I think he figured I'd tell him when I was ready, but I never have, not the whole truth anyway. I told my wife and a couple close friends eventually, after the nightmares started. They were skeptical, but supportive. My wife worries I had some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Maybe that would be easier to accept, but I know what I saw. I've spent my life in the outdoors. I know the difference between a bear and whatever that was. Those eyes, that intelligence, the way it moved with purpose. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, seeing those eyes watching me across the water. I never went back to that cove. Can't bring myself to. I still fish tournaments, but only in the busiest parts of Lake Ouachita, always within sight of the marinas and other boats. My fishing buddies think I'm getting soft in my old age, preferring the convenience of crowded spots to the solitude of the backwaters. Let them think that. Some nights I sit on my porch, staring into the dark tree line beyond our yard, wondering if it's out there, wondering if it recognized me as clearly as I recognized it as something that didn't belong, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't made it to my truck in time. I've read reports since then, accounts from others who've had similar experiences in the Ouachita area. I never comment, never share my story publicly. But I know they're telling the truth, because once you've seen those eyes looking back at you with an intelligence that shouldn't exist in something that massive, that wild, you know. The lake and I have a different relationship now. The water that once felt like home now feels like it's hiding secrets. I still go out there because fishing is in my blood. But I'm always watching the shoreline, always listening for that unnatural silence that falls when something impossible steps out of the trees. Story 9. I still don't know what to make of what happened last Friday night. I've told a few friends, but most just give me that look. You know the one, where they're trying to be polite, but clearly think you're full of it. I figured maybe writing it all down might help me process it, and hell, maybe someone else has seen the same thing. It was around 11:30 at night, and I'd just finished a late Walmart run in Spanaway. Nothing special, just groceries, some motor oil and dog food. I remember being annoyed because the store was about to close and the cashier was giving me attitude for shopping so late. Whatever. I loaded everything into my old Ford Ranger and started the drive home. My truck's been having issues lately. The passenger side headlight had burnt out earlier that week and I hadn't gotten around to replacing it yet. So I was driving with my high beams on, which I normally avoid doing because I don't want to blind other drivers. But at that hour on a weeknight, the roads were pretty empty and I was headed into the more rural stretch anyway. I turned onto 8th Avenue East, which starts off normal enough, but quickly turns into this dark country road that runs along the edge of Joint Base Lewis McChord. If you're not familiar with the area, JBLM is this massive military base that spans thousands of acres with lots of undeveloped forest land. Once you get about 4 or 5 miles out of town, it gets really dark. No streetlights, just trees on both sides, and hardly any houses. The radio was playing some late-night talk show, Coast to Coast AM or something similar, with people calling in about conspiracy theories and paranormal stuff. Normally I find that entertaining, but I wasn't really paying attention. I was mostly thinking about work the next day and mentally planning what I needed to do over the weekend. It had been raining earlier and the pavement was still wet, reflecting my headlights. The air was cool, maybe low 50s, and slightly foggy, just enough to create these weird light halos around my high beams. I had my window cracked open a bit and could smell that distinctive northwest pine and wet earth smell. I'd driven this route hundreds of times before, nothing special about it, just a straight shot through some woods, eventually connecting to the highway that would take me home. I was about 4 or 5 miles out from town when it happened. My high beams were cutting through the darkness ahead, illuminating maybe 400 feet of road. I wasn't going very fast, maybe 45 miles per hour. The speed limit out there is 55, but with one headlight and the wet roads, I was being cautious. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Something was moving across the road ahead, from left to right, something big, really big. My first thought was, maybe it was a bear, but it was all wrong. Bears don't move like that. This thing crossed the entire width of the road in 3 or 4 strides, long, purposeful strides. It was covered in dark, brownish hair, not black, more like a dark chocolate color, that looked almost reddish where my headlights hit it. The hair wasn't super long and matted like you might imagine, but more like a short, dense coat. But it wasn't just the color that struck me. It was the sheer size of this thing. The body looked massive through the chest, like impossibly thick from front to back. I'm talking maybe 2.5 to 3 feet thick. And tall? Jesus, it had to be at least 9 feet tall, maybe even more. I've seen plenty of elk and even a couple of moose in my life, and this thing dwarfed them. What happened next is what really messed with me. As it reached the right side of the road, it stopped mid-stride. It just paused. Then it turned its head and looked back directly at me and my truck. I swear to God, in that moment, it felt like time slowed down. I couldn't even hit the brakes. I was just frozen. The way it turned and looked back was so deliberate, so human-like, but not human at all. The face was dark, shadowed under what looked like a prominent brow ridge. I couldn't make out features clearly at that distance, but the shape of the head was distinctive, like a conical shape on top, not round like a human head. It reminded me instantly of the Patterson-Gimlin film. You know that famous footage from the 60s of a Bigfoot walking along a creek bed? The way it moved, the proportions, the way it turned to look, it was exactly like that, only this was no grainy old film. This was happening right in front of me on 8th Avenue East. The whole encounter probably lasted 3 or 4 seconds, but it felt like minutes. After it looked at me, it just continued into the woods on the right side of the road. No rush, no panic, just methodical, powerful movement, and then it was gone. I did hit the brakes then, hard enough that my groceries slid forward and crashed into the back of my seat. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my heart beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and get the hell out of there. Part of me was curious to stop and look for tracks or something. In the end, I didn't do either. I just sat there, processing what I'd seen, until a car appeared in my rearview mirror. The headlights snapped me back to reality, and I started driving again, probably a little too fast. I kept looking to my right, into the woods where it had disappeared, but all I could see was darkness between the trees. When I got home, I was still shaking. I brought the groceries inside, but I forgot the dog food in the truck and didn't even realize it until the next morning. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying those few seconds over and over in my mind, trying to convince myself that I'd seen a bear, or maybe even a person in some kind of costume. But I know what I saw. I didn't tell anyone for a few days. What was I supposed to say? Hey, guess what? I saw Bigfoot on my way home from Walmart. Yeah, right. People already think I'm a bit of an oddball since I moved out to the more rural part of the county. This would just confirm it for them. But then, 3 days later, I was at the gas station near my place, and I overheard this guy talking about how his girlfriend had seen something weird crossing the road about a mile from my house. I probably looked like a crazy person when I whipped around and asked him what she saw. He seemed taken aback, but told me she'd been driving home late one night and saw what she described as a really tall, hairy man dart across the road and disappear into the trees. She'd been too scared to talk about it much. That conversation led me to start asking around, carefully, you know, not wanting to sound like a lunatic. And surprisingly, I found out I wasn't the only one. There was this older guy at the hardware store whose father rides a Harley, and he told me his dad had seen something crossing at that small creek bridge about 2 miles further down from where I had my encounter. His dad was riding at midnight, and this thing just stepped out in front of him, forcing him to swerve. He described it almost exactly the same way, huge, brownish, and walked with these long strides. The more I asked, the more stories I heard, not a ton, but enough to form a pattern, all within about a 5-mile radius of where I saw it, all describing something similar, much taller than a human, covered in brown or reddish-brown hair, and moving with purpose. I've gone back to that stretch of road a few times since then, but only during daylight. I've pulled over and looked for tracks or hair caught on branches, anything that might confirm what I saw. I haven't found anything conclusive. The ground along the roadside is mostly gravel and hard-packed dirt, not great for leaving prints, and the woods get thick really quickly once you move away from the road. What keeps bothering me is the way it looked back. That wasn't random. That was, I don't know, acknowledgement, assessment. Whatever it was, there was intelligence behind that look. It knew I was there. It knew I could see it. Sometimes I wonder if I should report it somewhere official, but who would I even tell? The sheriff's department would probably laugh me out of the station, and I don't want to be that person who gets their name attached to a Bigfoot sighting in the local paper. But I know what I saw, and ever since that night I've been hyper-aware whenever I'm driving that road, especially after dark. I replaced my headlight the very next day. I keep my high beams on the entire stretch. I drive slower, and I can't help but scan the tree line on both sides of the road, looking for movement. The rational part of my brain tries to tell me there must be some explanation. Maybe it was someone in a costume playing a prank. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by shadows and my high beams. Maybe I was more tired than I thought after a long day. But then I remember the way it moved. So fluid and powerful, the way its muscles shifted under that coat of hair, the deliberate way it turned to look at me, and I know there's no costume on Earth that could mimic that kind of natural movement. No human could appear that size or move with that kind of grace while wearing some bulky suit. It's been 2 weeks now, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I've started researching similar sightings in the area. Turns out the forests around JBLM have had reports going back decades. Something about all that undeveloped land, the connection to the larger forest systems that stretch into the foothills of Mount Rainier. It makes sense as a habitat when you think about it. I drive that road differently now, more alert, more aware, and I can't shake the feeling that while I was watching it, it was also watching me, assessing me, maybe even recognizing my truck. Since I drive that road often, I don't know what it was. I don't know if I'll ever see it again, but I know that whatever crossed 8th Avenue East that night was no bear, no elk, and definitely no human. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late and I reach that exact spot, I slow down, almost hoping to catch another glimpse, but also terrified of exactly that. Story 10. It's taken me almost 3 decades to share this, but I still can't explain what I saw that evening in August 1996. I've gone over it countless times in my head, trying to make sense of it, but I just can't. I know what I saw wasn't normal, not even close. I was driving home after visiting my cousin, who lives about 20 minutes outside of Rivers, Manitoba. It was that time in summer when the days are getting shorter, but it's still warm enough to have your windows down. The sun had just set, leaving that bluish-grey light that makes everything look a bit off. I remember feeling tired. It had been a long day of helping my cousin repair some fence posts on his property. My muscles ached, and all I wanted was to get home, take a shower, and crash. The radio was playing softly. I think it was some country station, but I wasn't really paying attention. The prairies stretched out on either side of me, farmland for miles. You know how it is out here. Flat land, occasional farmhouse, and not much else. I'd made this drive hundreds of times before. Nothing special about it. I was about 10 minutes from home when I needed to turn onto the gravel road that connects to my property. I slowed down, checking my mirrors out of habit, even though there was no other traffic. That's when I noticed something odd in the ditch on the west side of the highway. At first, I figured one of the Hendersons' horses had gotten loose again. They owned the farm about half a mile down the road, and their fences weren't the best. It wouldn't have been the first time one of their animals wandered off, but something felt off. The shape wasn't quite right. I pulled over and stopped my truck completely, leaning over to peer through the passenger window. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't a horse. The outline was all wrong, too vertical. I remember my heart starting to beat faster. I shifted my truck into park and turned it slightly so my headlights would shine directly at whatever was in the ditch. I thought maybe it was a lost hiker or someone who'd had car trouble and was walking along the road. When the lights hit it, I froze. The figure was moving away from me, heading toward a small cluster of trees that bordered the farmland. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more, and it was covered in dark brown hair, not clothes, hair. It was walking upright on two legs, with a stride that was somehow both fluid and awkward at the same time. My first thought was, bear. We get black bears around here occasionally, though it's rare to see them this far into the farmlands. Sometimes they stand on their hind legs, especially if they're startled. But this thing didn't move like a bear. Bears only stay upright for a few seconds before dropping back to all fours. This, whatever it was, it kept walking on two legs. Its arms, if that's what they were, swung at its sides, longer than any human arms I've ever seen. The headlights caught it in profile for just a moment as it turned slightly to look back in my direction. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could tell it had noticed me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and my mouth went completely dry. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The creature took a few more steps, then suddenly increased its pace. It moved with this bizarre gait, not quite running but covering ground incredibly fast. Within seconds, it had reached the tree line and disappeared into the shadows. That's when I snapped out of it. I fumbled with the gear shift, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get it into drive. I stomped on the gas pedal, and the truck lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. I didn't even bother turning onto my road. I just continued straight down the highway toward town, my heart pounding in my ears. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, terrified I'd see that thing following me. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it all. Maybe it was just someone in a costume, but out here, miles from town, and who could move like that? The way it walked was just wrong, not human. After a couple of minutes of driving way too fast, I forced myself to slow down. I was breathing hard, like I'd just run a marathon. My t-shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air coming through the windows. I want to make this absolutely clear. I hadn't been drinking, not a drop. I don't even like alcohol. I was completely sober and alert. What I saw wasn't a hallucination or my mind playing tricks on me. It was real. I finally turned around and headed home, taking a different route that added about 15 minutes to my drive. I kept the windows up and the doors locked the whole way. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long time, engine running, trying to calm down. My house had never looked so inviting and terrifying at the same time. It sits on about 2 acres, with open fields on one side and a small wooded area on the other. I suddenly realized how isolated my place was. If that thing decided to come here, I rushed inside, locked all the doors and windows, and pulled the curtains closed. I checked every room, closet, and even under the beds before I could breathe normally again. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with every light in the house turned on, jumping at every little sound. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind. The height of it, the way it moved, the dark outline against the dimming sky. I tried to convince myself it was just a bear, but I knew better. Bears don't move like that. The next morning, after the sun was fully up, I drove back to where I'd seen it. I parked on the shoulder and walked cautiously to the ditch, scanning the tree line constantly. The grass in the ditch was flattened in places, but that could have been from anything. Deer, coyotes, or even just the wind. There were no obvious footprints in the soft ground, nothing I could point to as evidence. I stood there for a long time, staring at those trees, wondering if it was watching me. The entire area felt different somehow, like the encounter had changed something fundamental about this stretch of road I'd driven 1,000 times before. For weeks afterward, I avoided driving that route after dark. When I had to pass that spot, I'd speed up, eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at the ditch or the trees. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Not at first. This is Manitoba, practical, no-nonsense farm country. People don't believe in monsters here, but the experience stayed with me. I'd catch myself staring out windows at night, watching the darkness. I installed motion sensor lights all around my property. I started keeping my hunting rifle closer to my bed. Eventually, I mentioned it to my cousin. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he didn't laugh or call me crazy. He just asked, "You think it was a Bigfoot?" I hadn't used that word, even in my own thoughts. Saying it out loud made it sound ridiculous. But what else could it have been? Too big for a person, wrong shape for a bear. Definitely not any other animal native to Manitoba. "I don't know what it was," I told him. "I just know what I saw." Over the years, I've done some research. Turns out there have been other sightings in Manitoba, though not many near rivers specifically. Most reports come from more heavily wooded areas to the east or north, but they describe similar things: tall, hair-covered figures moving upright through the wilderness. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it around here. If they have, they're keeping quiet too. Can't say I blame them. Who wants to be known as the local crackpot who thinks they saw Bigfoot? What bothers me most is that I can't explain it. I'm a practical person. I fix things for a living. I understand how machines work, how to solve problems. But this doesn't fit into my understanding of the world. I still live in the same house, still drive those same roads. But I'm more aware now of how little we really know about the wilderness around us, even in these seemingly tame farm areas. There are spaces between the farms, patches of forest, ravines, places where something could hide, something that doesn't want to be seen. It's been 27 years since that evening in August, and I've never seen it again. Sometimes I almost convince myself it didn't happen, almost. But then I'll be driving home as the sun sets, and I'll pass that spot with the ditch and the trees, and the feeling comes rushing back, that moment when I realized I was looking at something impossible. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw that night on a lonely stretch of Manitoba highway. Something was there, something that shouldn't exist, but does. And sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder where it is now, and if it remembers seeing me too. Story 11. We'd been planning this trip for weeks. The weather forecast was perfect. Cool, but not freezing. Overcast, but no rain. Jim had spotted some promising deer sign the week before while scouting, so we were hopeful about our chances. We arrived at our spot before dawn, about a 20-minute hike from where we'd parked the truck. We climbed into the deer stand just as the sky was beginning to lighten. The stand was nothing fancy, just a wooden platform about 12 feet up an old oak tree with a metal ladder attached to the trunk. It gave us a good view of a small clearing with thick woods beyond. The morning was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves in the light breeze. For the first couple hours, we saw nothing. I was starting to get that restless feeling you get when sitting still for too long. Jim was scrolling through his phone, and I was thinking about suggesting we move to another spot when I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. "Jim," I whispered, nudging him, "look." He put his phone away and raised his binoculars. A group of wild hogs had emerged from the tree line, about 40 feet from our position. There were maybe 6 or 7 of them, rooting around in the soil, not what we were hunting for, but interesting to watch nonetheless. "Should we take a shot?" Jim whispered. "We had tags for hogs too, and the meat's decent if you prepare it right." I was about to respond when something caught my eye beyond the hogs. At first, I thought it might be another hog, but the movement was different, more deliberate, smoother somehow. "Hold up," I said quietly. "Do you see that? Behind the hogs, near that fallen log." Jim adjusted his binoculars. "What am I looking for?" "I don't know exactly. Something's moving out there." We both went silent, watching. The hogs continued foraging, seemingly unaware of anything unusual. Then I saw it more clearly, a large figure moving in a crouched position along the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by undergrowth. It was stalking the hogs, moving with surprising stealth for its size. "Do you see it now?" I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry. "Yeah," Jim replied, his voice barely audible. "What the hell is that?" We watched for several minutes, neither of us speaking. The creature, and I use that word deliberately because it was immediately clear this wasn't a normal animal, continued its slow, methodical movement. It was hard to make out details through the brush, but I could see it was covered in what looked like reddish-brown hair or fur. It moved with purpose, stopping occasionally to observe the hogs, then continuing its approach. My heart was pounding so hard, I was worried the creature might hear it. Jim and I had hunted these woods for years and never seen anything like this. Black bears occasionally passed through the area, but this wasn't a bear. The way it moved was too deliberate, too calculated. Suddenly, the creature made a sound, a sort of blowing or huffing noise, similar to the warning sound a deer makes, but deeper, more forceful. The hogs perked up at this, becoming alert, but not yet panicked. My hands were shaking. I reached for my shotgun, just wanting the reassurance of holding it. As I lifted it from where it was propped against the railing, my elbow bumped the metal frame of the stand with a hollow clang that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet woods. What happened next will be burned into my memory until the day I die. The creature immediately stood upright. Not gradually or cautiously, it shot up to its full height in one fluid motion. The hogs scattered instantly, squealing in terror as they crashed through the underbrush, but I barely registered them. My attention was fixed entirely on what stood at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Its entire body was covered in that reddish-brown hair I'd glimpsed earlier, but now I could see it was coarser than I'd thought, almost shaggy in places. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging well past its waist, ending in what looked disturbingly like hands. Not paws, but actual hands with opposable thumbs. The face. God. The face. It wasn't completely visible beneath the hair, but I could see enough. The features were almost human-like, but distorted somehow. A prominent brow, a flat nose, and eyes that seemed to reflect a terrible intelligence. Those eyes locked onto us immediately, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, unlike anything I've ever experienced. For a moment, it couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. We all just froze, Jim and I in the stand, paralyzed with shock and terror, and the creature standing perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those unnervingly aware eyes. Jim broke the silence with a strangled whisper. "We need to go. Now." I couldn't even respond verbally. I just nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from the creature. It hadn't moved, but somehow its stillness was more terrifying than if it had charged us. It was assessing us, thinking. We began gathering our gear as quickly and quietly as possible, both of us fumbling with cold, trembling hands. I nearly dropped my shotgun twice. Jim kept glancing over his shoulder at the creature, which remained motionless, just watching. "Leave the rest," Jim hissed when I started to pack up our thermos and extra ammunition. "Just take the guns. We need to go." We descended the ladder one at a time, me first, then Jim. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to move deliberately, afraid that sudden movement might trigger the creature to charge. My boots felt impossibly heavy as I reached the ground, and I had to consciously remind myself to breathe. Jim practically jumped the last few rungs and landed beside me with a soft thud. "The four-wheeler," he said under his breath. "Don't run until we're out of sight." We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the clearing. The creature had shifted position slightly, but was still watching us. As soon as we were among the trees and partially hidden from view, we turned and moved faster, still not quite running, but walking as quickly as possible without making too much noise. The four-wheeler was where we'd left it, covered with a camo tarp about a quarter-mile from the stand. Jim yanked the tarp off while I kept watch, my shotgun ready, though I'm not sure what good I thought it would do. The forest suddenly seemed alive with potential threats, every shadow potentially hiding another creature. "Get on," Jim said, his voice tense as he straddled the four-wheeler and turned the key. The engine roared to life, sounding obscenely loud in the quiet woods. I climbed on behind him, still clutching my shotgun. Jim didn't waste any time. He gunned the engine, and we shot forward down the narrow trail that led back to the main forest road. I clung to the back of the seat with one hand, my other still gripping my gun. The wind rushed past us, branches occasionally whipping at our arms and faces, but Jim didn't slow down. Something made me look back, some sixth sense or primal instinct. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I twisted in my seat and caught a glimpse of the clearing we'd just fled. The creature was standing by a large pine tree at the edge of the open space. Even at that distance, I could tell it was watching us go. It made no move to follow, no attempt to chase us. It just stood there, observing our retreat with what I can only describe as cold curiosity. That image, the tall, hair-covered figure silhouetted against the trees watching us, is what keeps me awake at night now. We didn't stop until we reached Jim's truck. We loaded the four-wheeler onto the trailer in record time, threw our gear into the cab, and got the hell out of there. Neither of us spoke for a good 20 minutes, as Jim drove well above the speed limit on the winding country roads. Finally, when we were back on the highway heading toward town, Jim broke the silence. "What was that?" he asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "I really don't know." We spent the rest of the drive theorizing. A bear standing on its hind legs? No, the proportions were all wrong, and the hands, bears don't have hands like that. Some kind of escaped zoo animal, but what kind would be 7 feet tall with that build? A person in a costume, in the middle of hunting season, miles from any road? No way. We both knew what it looked like. We just couldn't bring ourselves to say it out loud at first. It wasn't until we stopped for gas that Jim finally said the word. "Bigfoot," he said quietly as we stood by the pump. "That's what we saw, isn't it?" I didn't answer immediately. The word seemed ridiculous, something from tabloid headlines and late-night conspiracy shows, but the image of that creature was still fresh in my mind. The height, the build, the hair, those hands, those eyes. "Yeah," I finally admitted. "I think it was. We agreed not to tell anyone right away. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of town, labeled as drunks who couldn't tell a bear from a bush. But the experience has been eating at me. I haven't slept more than a few hours at a stretch since it happened. Every time I close my eyes, I see those intelligent eyes staring back at me. The strangest part is that I don't think it meant us harm. It could have easily reached our stand before we even got to the four-wheeler if it had wanted to. It was just watching us, studying us, maybe, the same way we had been studying it at first. Jim wants to go back with cameras. He's convinced we could get proof, make some kind of scientific discovery. I'm not so sure. Something about that creature's gaze told me it was far more intelligent than we give credit to these beings. It's managed to stay hidden all these years for a reason, and something tells me it wouldn't appreciate us coming back with the intention of exposing it. For now, I've told everyone we just had an unsuccessful hunting trip. I haven't been back in those woods, and honestly, I don't know if I ever will be. Some things are better left alone, and some mysteries might be safer unsolved. But every time the wind blows hard against my window at night, I think about that huffing sound it made. And I wonder if, somewhere out in those dark woods, it's thinking about us too. Story 12. I've never told this story to many people. Most who've heard it think I'm crazy or making it up for attention. But what I saw that day in November of 1968 has stayed with me for all these years. It's as clear in my mind today as it was then. I was 23 years old and had been hunting in the mountains near the Clackamas River in Oregon. I wasn't hunting for deer or elk that day, just exploring really. I had my rifle with me, but was more interested in scouting the area for future hunts. The wilderness out there was pretty remote back then, even more so than now. You could go days without seeing another person. It was cold that morning, probably around 30 degrees, when I started hiking up toward one of the ridges. I remember the frost on the ground crunching under my boots. I was wearing my old green wool coat, a flannel shirt underneath, and a knit cap. Nothing fancy, just practical stuff for the woods. By midday, I'd reached the top of this ridge. Must have been about 3,500 feet elevation. The sun had warmed things up to maybe 50 degrees. I remember taking off my hat and wiping sweat from my forehead. The view was incredible. You could see for miles across the valley all those dark green forests with patches of light coming through the clouds. The Clackamas River looked like a thin silver thread from that height. I sat down to eat the sandwich I'd packed, just peanut butter on white bread, nothing special, and take a drink from my canteen. That's when I noticed something moving in the tall grass, maybe 200 yards away on a south-facing slope. At first, I thought it might be elk, but the movement seemed off somehow. I pulled out my binoculars. They were nothing fancy, just some 7x35s my dad had given me, and focused on the area. What I saw, well, I still get chills thinking about it. There were two creatures lying in the grass. They weren't bears, they weren't humans, but they weren't apes either. At least not like any I'd seen in books or at the zoo. They were just different. My first thought was to grab my rifle, not to shoot, but just because having it in my hands made me feel safer. But then I realized they hadn't seen me. They were just lying there, completely unaware of my presence. So I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, and just watched them through my binoculars. These creatures were huge. I'd guess at least 7 feet tall if they'd been standing. They were covered in hair, not fur like a bear, but hair, reddish-brown in color. The hair seemed longer in some places than others, especially around their heads. They were lying with their backs up, elbows and knees tucked underneath them, like dogs do when they're resting but staying alert. The position made them look somewhat human, but also animal-like. What struck me most was how comfortable they seemed, how natural. They weren't acting scared or agitated. They were just relaxing in the sun, like they belonged there. And maybe they did. I must have watched them for nearly an hour without moving. My legs started to cramp, but I was afraid any movement would alert them to my presence. Through the binoculars, I could make out details that made my heart race. These weren't males, they were females. Both had long breasts that hung down when they shifted positions. The breasts moved naturally with their bodies. It sounds weird to mention this, but it's an important detail. These weren't guys in suits. No one would fake something like that. Their faces were, God, how do I describe them? Kind of flat with wide noses, almost like a cross between a human and a gorilla, but not exactly either. Their brow ridges were prominent and their eyes were deep set. I couldn't make out the color of their eyes from that distance, but they seemed dark. After watching them for what felt like forever, they suddenly both sat up. I froze, thinking they'd spotted me, but they were looking in another direction. Then they stood up. The way they stood and walked was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was completely natural, completely bipedal. They weren't hunched over like gorillas. They stood straight up and walked with long, easy strides. Their arms swung naturally at their sides. One was noticeably larger than the other, maybe 6 inches taller and heavier built. I guessed maybe a mother and daughter, or 2 females of different ages. They walked down the slope toward a small creek that fed into the Clackamas. Their movements were so fluid, so natural. They moved through that rough terrain like they'd been born to it, which I guess they had been. When they reached the creek, they started pulling up plants along the bank. I could see them examining what they'd pulled up, picking through it with what looked like fingers, not paws, actual fingers, and eating certain parts. They were selective about what they ate, discarding some parts and carefully consuming others. That's when the larger one did something that still echoes in my nightmares sometimes. She stood up straight and let out this vocalization that's almost impossible to describe. It wasn't a simple shout or yell. It was like, imagine someone screaming into a metal barrel, but with this weird harmonic quality that carried across the entire valley. It started low and rose in pitch before dropping again. The sound echoed off the mountains, making it impossible to tell exactly where it had come from if you hadn't seen it happen. After she made this call, they both seemed to listen for a response. I didn't hear anything, but the smaller one made a different sound, shorter, almost like a bark. Then they went back to gathering plants. I stayed there watching them until the light started to fade. It gets dark early in November in those mountains, and I knew I'd have to start heading back soon or risk getting caught in the dark. The temperature was dropping fast too. Just as I was thinking about leaving, the larger one looked up, not directly at me, but in my general direction. I froze completely, not even breathing. She stood there for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, just staring. Then she made a low, grunting sound, and both creatures gathered up some of the plants they'd collected and walked into the tree line. I waited another 20 minutes to make sure they were gone before I finally moved. My legs were so stiff I could barely stand up. I felt dizzy, partly from not moving for so long and partly from what I'd seen. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely put my binoculars back in their case. The walk back to my truck was terrifying. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow looked like one of those creatures. I kept thinking I heard that strange call again, but it was probably just my imagination. I practically ran the last mile to my truck. When I got home that night, I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I tried to convince myself that I'd seen bears, or maybe even people in the distance that my mind had somehow distorted. But the details were too clear, too specific. Those weren't bears, they weren't people, they were something else. A week later, I went back to that same ridge with my camera. I don't know what I was thinking, that they'd be in the exact same spot, that I'd get proof. Of course, there was nothing there, no sign they'd ever existed except for some trampled grass near the creek that could have been made by anything. In the years since, I've read everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings. Some of the descriptions match what I saw, others don't. I've never gone public with my story because I know what would happen. I'd be labeled a crackpot or attention seeker. My own brother laughed at me the one time I tried to tell him, but I know what I saw that day. They were real, they were intelligent, they moved with purpose and communicated with each other. They weren't just animals, but they weren't human either. They were something in between. I've gone back to that area many times over the years, hoping to see them again. I never have. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, or if they're gone now, pushed out by logging and development. I wonder if they were the last of their kind, or if there are more living in the remote corners of our wilderness. Whatever they were, seeing them changed me, made me realize that we don't know everything about this world, not by a long shot. There are still mysteries out there in the deep woods, things science hasn't explained or even acknowledged. I'm an old man now, and I don't get up to the mountains much anymore. My knees can't handle those steep trails, but I still think about those creatures almost every day. I still hear that strange call in my dreams, and I still wonder what would have happened if they'd seen me watching them that cold November day in 1968. Story 13. I've never told this story online before, but I need to get this off my chest. It's been nearly 30 years, and I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat when I hear strange noises outside. This happened in October of '94. My family had this small property in the Ozarks, Missouri. Nothing fancy, just a modest house perched on a ridge, and an old wooden barn a few hundred yards down the slope where we kept some goats, hay, and feed. I loved that place, despite its isolation. The woods, the hills, the clean air, it was peaceful. Until that night. I remember it was close to midnight. I'd always been a light sleeper, especially on autumn nights when the windows were still open to let in that crisp mountain air. I was just drifting off when I noticed something odd. The night had gone completely silent, and I mean silent. If you've ever lived in rural Missouri, you know the nights are filled with sound. frogs croaking, crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, but suddenly nothing, like someone had flipped a switch. That's what woke me initially, not a noise, but the absence of noise. I sat up in bed, my skin already prickling with goosebumps. That's when I heard it, a deep, powerful roar that seemed to roll up from the hollow below our property. It was so loud and so powerful that the windows of my bedroom actually rattled. I felt it in my chest, like standing too close to a speaker at a concert. I'd heard mountain lions before. I'd heard angry bulls. Hell, I'd even heard bears once on a camping trip up in Montana. This wasn't like any of those. This was different, primal, ancient. Then I heard our goats. We had 7 of them down in that barn, and suddenly they were all bleating in absolute panic. I'd heard them scared before during thunderstorms or when a coyote got too close, but this was different. They sounded terrified. I don't know what possessed me to go check it out instead of waking up my parents or grabbing a gun. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was concern for the goats. Whatever the reason, I pulled on my jeans and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out onto the porch. It was one of those clear autumn nights with a full moon, so bright you could almost read by it. The air was cool and still. I switched off my flashlight since I could see just fine in the moonlight. As soon as I looked down toward the barn, I froze. Something was moving around it, something massive. At first, I thought maybe a bear had gotten onto our property and was trying to get at the goats. But as I watched, I realized this was way too big for any black bear native to Missouri. Whatever this thing was, it was huge and it was angry. It was striking the barn with incredible force. Each blow made the whole structure shudder and shake. Dust was rising from the roof with each impact. The old boards rattled like they might come apart at any moment. And the goats inside were absolutely losing it, their bleats turning into screams. I stood there paralyzed, my heart hammering in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then the thing stepped into a patch of moonlight, and I swear my blood turned to ice. It was enormous, taller than the barn door, which I knew was about 7 feet. Its body was massive, covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. The shoulders were extraordinarily wide, and its arms, God, its arms were long, hanging down almost to its knees. Its head sat directly on those shoulders, no neck that I could see, and sloped upward to a rounded peak. And its eyes, even from that distance, I could see its eyes caught the moonlight with a faint reddish glow, like a deer's eyes in headlights, but darker, more sinister. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe, I couldn't even think. All I could do was watch as this creature, this thing that shouldn't exist, circled our barn. It would walk around the structure, sometimes reaching out to drag those massive hands down the wooden boards, leaving deep gouges in its wake. Sometimes it would rear back and strike the wall with what looked like its fist, making a sound like a sledgehammer hitting wood. Other times, it would lower that massive shoulder and slam into the side of the barn with such force that I heard something crack inside. The roars it let out were unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. They weren't just loud, they seemed to shake the very air itself. I could feel them in my chest, in my bones. They were rage and frustration and something else, something almost like hunger. At one point it tried to open the barn doors. I watched in horror as those massive hands gripped the edges and pulled. Thankfully, we had a heavy iron latch on those doors. My dad had installed it after a bear got into the feed a few years back. The latch held, but I could see the hinges straining. The creature roared again, even louder this time, clearly frustrated by the obstacle. I don't know how long I stood there watching. It felt like hours, but was probably about 20 minutes. The creature continued its assault on the barn, striking it, clawing at it, roaring its rage into the night. The goats' cries had become weaker, almost like they were going hoarse from fear. Then after one particularly powerful blow that split a board with a crack that echoed across the property, the creature suddenly stopped. It stood there for a moment, its massive chest heaving, and then it turned. It walked away from the barn with long, powerful strides that covered ground frighteningly fast. Within seconds, it had reached the tree line at the edge of our property. It paused there, silhouetted against the darkness of the forest, and for one terrible moment, I thought it turned its head toward the house, toward me. Then it was gone, vanishing into the trees so quickly and silently that I wondered for a split second if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the goats were still bleating in terror, and the night was still unnaturally quiet. I don't remember going back inside or getting into bed. The next thing I recall is waking up as dawn was breaking, wondering if it had all been a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't. I'd seen it all too clearly. As soon as there was enough light, I went down to the barn. My parents were still asleep, and I didn't wake them. I needed to see the evidence myself first. The barn told the story, deep parallel gouges in the walls, some of them penetrating clear through the aged wood. Boards cracked and splintered, the door hinges were bent, though the iron latch had held firm. Inside, the goats were huddled together in the corner, still visibly shaken. Miraculously, none of them were hurt, but they flinched at every sound. What really confirmed it for me were the footprints in the soft dirt around the barn. Enormous footprints, about 18 inches long, shaped like bare human feet with visible toes. They were deeply pressed into the ground, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I stood there looking at those tracks, and all I could think was, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. I just witnessed an actual living Sasquatch come down from the hills and attack our barn. When my parents woke up, I told them what happened. My dad didn't believe me at first, thought maybe a bear had gotten into the property. But when he saw those footprints, the color drained from his face. He took pictures, made plaster casts, even called a buddy of his who was a game warden, but officially it was logged as vandalism or bear activity. We reinforced the barn the next day, added metal bracing, stronger locks, even ran an electric fence around it. The goats eventually calmed down, but they were never quite the same. More skittish, more alert, like they knew something was out there. We never had another direct encounter like that one, but there were signs over the next few years, strange noises at night, finding branches broken too high up for a human to reach. Once, a deer carcass in our yard that had been torn apart with incredible strength. I've read about Sasquatch encounters since then. Some people report them as curious, even peaceful creatures. What I saw that night wasn't peaceful. It was rage personified, a primal fury directed at our barn and the animals inside. Maybe it was hungry. Maybe it was defending territory. Maybe it was just angry that humans were encroaching on its home. I don't know. What I do know is that I'll never forget the sight of that massive figure in the moonlight, or the sound of its roars echoing up from the hollow. I know what I saw that night in '94, and no one will ever convince me otherwise. Something inhabits the deep woods of the Ozarks, something most people only believe exists in legends and campfire stories. I've since moved away from Missouri, built a life in the city where the only sounds at night are traffic and sirens. Sometimes I miss the peace of those hills, but on the nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the silence before the roar, I'm glad for the city lights and the concrete that keeps the wilderness at bay. Story 14. I still remember that morning like it happened yesterday, even though it's been about a year now. I've typed this out like 20 times and deleted it every time, but I need to get this off my chest. I don't care if anyone believes me, I just need someone to hear this. So we were on this camping trip with our fraternity, just a weekend thing to get away from campus before finals week kicked in. We'd found this spot about an hour from school, nothing fancy, just a clearing by a river with some hills around it. The kind of place that feels isolated without being too far from civilization. We'd gotten there Friday evening, set up our tents, got a fire going, drank some beers, typical college guy stuff. Saturday morning, I woke up early. The sun was barely coming up, maybe around 7 a.m. and most of the guys were still passed out in their tents. I needed to take a leak, so I crawled out of my tent and saw that Matt and Derek were already up, just sitting by the dying embers of last night's fire. "We need more wood," Matt said when he saw me. "Fire's almost out." So the three of us grabbed our hoodies, it was chilly that morning, and headed toward this small hill near our campsite. We only had one flashlight between us because nobody planned on getting up that early. Derek had it, leading the way as we climbed up this brush-covered hill toward the tree line. The ground was damp from morning dew, and it made the whole trek slippery and annoying. We just reached the trees at the top when I heard it. At first, it was just a subtle rustling sound coming from deeper in the woods, maybe about 100 feet away. I remember freezing in place, thinking it might be a deer or something. Matt and Derek heard it too. We all stopped moving at the same time. "You guys hear that?" I whispered. The rustling got louder, and then we heard branches snapping. Not little twigs, but the kind of heavy breaks that happen when something big moves through dense forest. Whatever it wasn't being careful. It was just pushing through, breaking everything in its path. "It's probably just a deer," Derek said, but his voice was tense. None of us believed it was a deer. Deer don't usually crash through woods like that. The sound was getting closer, and I swear I could feel the vibration in the ground. Matt, always the impulsive one, picked up a rock about the size of his fist and threw it in the direction of the noise. The rock disappeared into the trees with a soft thud. For a moment, everything went silent. The rustling stopped. The breaking branches stopped. Just complete silence. "See? Scared it away," Matt whispered, looking relieved. But then it started again. Only this time, it wasn't just moving through the forest anymore. It was running directly toward us. I've never felt fear like that before. It was primal. My heart literally stopped for a second before hammering against my chest so hard I thought it might break my ribs. We didn't even look at each other. We just turned and ran. I don't remember much about running down that hill. I know I fell at least once, sliding through wet leaves and mud. My hands were scraped raw. I remember hearing Matt yelling something behind me, but I didn't stop to look back. The only thought in my head was getting back to the campfire, to where our other friends were. We burst into the clearing where our tents were set up, all of us gasping for air. A couple of the other guys had woken up and were sitting around, looking confused as hell as we came crashing back into camp. "What the fuck, guys?" Jason asked, looking up from his coffee. I tried to explain, but I couldn't catch my breath. Derek was doubled over, hands on his knees. Matt was the only one who could speak. "Something was chasing us," he managed to get out. "In the woods. Something big." The other guys looked at each other, then back at us like we were crazy. Jason stood up, staring past us toward the hill we'd just run down. "I don't hear anything," he said, and he was right. There was nothing. No crashing, no footsteps, no breaking branches. Just the normal morning forest sounds had returned. Birds chirping, the distant babble of the river. But then I smelled it. It hit me so suddenly I almost gagged. This rancid, musty stench like dead fish left in stagnant water for days. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was wrong somehow, like it didn't belong in that clean forest air. I saw Derek's nose wrinkle too. "You smell that?" I asked the group. Some of them nodded, others looked confused. The smell lingered for maybe 30 seconds, then dissipated as suddenly as it had appeared. We tried explaining what happened, but it sounded ridiculous, even as we were saying it. None of us had actually seen anything. We'd just heard it moving toward us. The breaking branches, the running, the smell. It all seemed less convincing in the daylight, surrounded by people who hadn't experienced it. "Maybe it was a bear," Jason suggested, but there was doubt in his voice. Bears don't usually charge like that unless provoked, and they certainly don't stop when you run away. They chase you down. We were all on edge after that. No one wanted to go back into those woods, not even in a group. By unspoken agreement, we started packing up our stuff. Nobody was having fun anymore, and we all just wanted to get back to campus. As we were loading the cars, Kyle, one of the quieter guys in our frat, came over to where I was stuffing my sleeping bag into its case. "I believe you guys," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Yeah?" I wasn't sure what to say. I was still trying to process what had happened myself. Kyle nodded. "When I was younger, my family lived up the river from here, maybe 15 miles north. Something similar happened to us." I stopped what I was doing and waited for him to continue. "I was about 12, he said. "My parents had gone out for the evening, and I was home with my older sister. It was winter, and it had been snowing earlier that day, but it had turned to rain by nightfall." He paused, and I could tell he was uncomfortable sharing this. Around midnight, something started banging on the side of our house. Not knocking, banging like it was hitting the walls with its fists. It went all around the house, just banging. We were terrified. My sister called our parents, but they were at least 40 minutes away. "What did you do?" I asked. "We hid in the bathroom with a kitchen knife until our parents got home. By then, whatever it was had gone. But in the morning..." He trailed off. "What?" "There were footprints in the mud all around our house. Bare footprints, human-shaped, but way bigger than any human foot I've ever seen. My dad took pictures, but it started raining again before we could really document them properly. By afternoon, they were just puddles." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You think that's what was out there this morning?" I asked. Kyle shrugged. "I don't know, but that smell you described, that's what our house smelled like that night, like something had died in stagnant water. It lingered for days." We finished packing in silence after that. The drive back to campus was quiet too, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Matt tried to joke about it a couple times, suggesting maybe we'd disturbed Bigfoot's morning routine, but it fell flat. None of us were laughing. Back on campus, life quickly returned to normal. Finals week came and went. We didn't talk about what happened that morning, at least not with each other. I tried mentioning it to my roommate once, but he just looked at me like I was nuts, so I dropped it. But I can't stop thinking about it. Some nights I wake up sweating, convinced I can hear branches breaking outside my window. The smell comes back to me in nightmares, that putrid, musty stench that doesn't belong in this world. I've done some research since then. There are stories all over the internet about similar encounters. People hearing something large moving through forests. The same distinctive smell, footprints that don't match any known animal. Most people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but those names make it sound like a joke, like something from a cheesy TV show. Whatever was on that hill that morning wasn't a joke. It was real. It was intelligent enough to stop when Matt threw that rock, to assess the situation, and it was fast enough that it could have caught us if it wanted to. I'm convinced of that now. We were stumbling down that hill, falling over ourselves in panic. If that thing really wanted to reach us, it would have. So why didn't it? That's the question that keeps me awake at night. Why chase us at all if not to catch us? Sometimes I think about going back there, just to see if there's any evidence of what happened. Broken branches, unusual tracks, anything. But then I remember how it felt in those moments. The absolute certainty that if that thing caught us, something terrible would happen, and I know I'll never go back to those woods again. I haven't been camping since that trip. Haven't even been hiking. The thought of being in dense trees where I can't see more than a few feet ahead makes my heart race. Matt and Derek avoid the subject entirely now. Kyle transferred to another school last semester. Said he wanted to be closer to home. But I wonder if he just couldn't stand being near those woods anymore. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I try to convince myself it didn't happen the way I remember it. Maybe it really was just a bear. Maybe the smell was just some weird forest fungus. Maybe the whole thing was amplified by lack of sleep and the disorientation of being in an unfamiliar place. But deep down, I know what I experienced. I know what I heard crashing through those trees, running toward us with purpose. I know what I smelled, and sometimes, in my darkest moments, I'm afraid that whatever it was, it's still out there. And worse, that it remembers us too. Story 15. I still don't know what to make of what happened that day back in April of '81. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my mind, and nothing makes sense. I've lived on Rocky Boy Reservation my whole life, and strange things happen in the mountains sometimes, but nothing like this. It was late April, unseasonably warm that year. I remember because my garden was already starting to come up, and I was proud of getting an early start. I'd gotten up early that morning to check on my plants when I noticed something was wrong. The garden looked trampled, not like deer or anything I was used to. This was different. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. There were these massive footprints pressed deep into the soft soil of my garden. Not just one or two, I counted 30 of them, making a clear path straight through. They were huge. I grabbed a ruler from the shed and measured them, 14 inches long. Who or what has a 14-inch foot? But it wasn't just the length that was weird. These prints were sunk in about 8 inches deep into the soil. 8 inches, and they only had 4 toes. Not 5 like a human, but 4 distinct toe impressions. I remember crouching down and just staring at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They looked fresh, probably from the night before. I called my cousin over who lived nearby, and he couldn't believe it either. We followed the trail of prints from my garden. They headed straight toward the Bear Paw Mountains. The prints were consistently deep the whole way, until they disappeared, where the ground got rockier. My cousin suggested we call tribal police, so we did. Captain Larry Bernard showed up about an hour later. I'd known Larry for years. He's a big guy, maybe 6'2" and around 200 pounds. He took one look at those prints and got real quiet. "Anyone else been out here?" he asked. And we told him no, just us. And we'd been careful not to mess with the prints. Larry did something I'll never forget. He stepped into the soft ground right next to one of the prints and pressed down with all his weight. His boot barely sank an inch into the soil. Then he jumped up and down a couple times on the same spot, maybe 3 inches deep at most. "Whatever made these weighs a hell of a lot more than me," he said, looking troubled. While Larry was taking photos and measurements, my cousin noticed something on the barbed wire fence that surrounds my property. Caught in the barbs were several strands of reddish-colored hair. Not like the brownish fur you'd see from a deer or elk. This was long, thick, and coarse, almost human-looking, but not quite. And definitely not from any animal I recognized from around here. Larry collected the hairs carefully, putting them in a small envelope. He said he'd try to have someone look at them, though I don't know if that ever happened. The reservation doesn't exactly have a forensics lab. By afternoon, word had spread. Several elders came by, and they got real quiet when they saw the prints. One of the older men, who never talked much, said something in Cree that made the others nod. They wouldn't translate it directly for me, but my cousin later said it had something to do with the one who walks alone in the mountains. I spent the rest of the day fixing my garden as best I could and trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. My brother Tommy was supposed to come by for dinner, but he was running late. The sun was starting to set, and I remember being annoyed because I'd made his favorite stew. Around dusk, I was sitting in the living room when I heard something outside. Not like a person walking or an animal moving through brush. This was different. It was a sort of rhythmic huffing sound, almost like heavy breathing, but louder than any person could make, and there was a smell that seemed to seep in through the closed windows, musky and wild, like wet fur, but stronger and more, I don't know, primal somehow. I grabbed my flashlight and my rifle. I'm not stupid enough to go investigate strange noises unarmed, and stepped onto the porch. The security light was on, but it only lit up the immediate area around the house. Beyond that was darkness, with the Bear Paw Mountains just a black outline against the darkening sky. The huffing sound had stopped as soon as I opened the door. I swept the flashlight beam across the yard, but didn't see anything unusual. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, though. You know that sensation when you can just feel eyes on you? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. I called out, thinking maybe it was Tommy playing a joke, but there was no answer. Just this heavy silence that seemed worse than the strange noises. I was about to go back inside when I heard something moving quickly through the brush beyond my property line. Not towards me, but away, fast. Whatever it was big enough to make branches snap and undergrowth crush loudly as it moved. I went back inside, double-checked all the locks and kept my rifle close. About 20 minutes later, Tommy's truck pulled up. He came in looking shaken, which isn't like him at all. Tommy's the unflappable type, worked construction his whole life, not easily spooked. "You're not gonna believe what I just saw," he said, before I could even ask what was wrong. He'd been driving up the road that leads to my place when his headlights caught something crossing about 50 yards ahead of him. At first, he thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but as he got closer, he realized it wasn't a bear at all. It was running upright, like a man, Tommy told me, still visibly rattled. But it was huge, way taller than any person I've ever seen, and it was covered in this reddish-brown hair all over its body. I showed him the strands we'd found on the fence, and he nodded emphatically. "That's it. That's exactly the color." What really got to me was how Tommy described the way it moved. Not awkward like you'd expect from something that big. It was fast and fluid, disappearing into the tree line before he could get a really good look. But what he did see was enough to convince him this wasn't a person in a costume or any animal he recognized. It had this massive upper body, he said. Shoulders twice as wide as a big man's, and the arms were long, hanging down past where its knees would be. We stayed up late that night talking in low voices, jumping at every sound outside. Tommy ended up sleeping on my couch instead of driving home. Neither of us wanted to admit we were scared, but we were. The next morning, we went out to where Tommy said he'd seen the creature cross the road. There, in the soft shoulder, were 2 distinct footprints, the same 4-toed impressions I'd found in my garden. Only these weren't as deep, since the ground was harder. We tried to follow them, but they disappeared into the rocky terrain leading toward the mountains. We searched for a couple hours, but found nothing else. Over the next few days, more people from the reservation came to see the footprints in my garden before they eventually got washed away by rain. Some took pictures. A few of the elders performed a small ceremony that they said was for protection. I never saw the creature myself. Part of me is grateful for that, but another part wishes I'd gotten a glimpse, just so I could be sure of what we were dealing with. The physical evidence was undeniable, though, those impossibly deep footprints that even a 200-pound man couldn't replicate, the strange reddish hair that didn't match any known animal, and of course, Tommy's sighting. I've heard stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch my whole life, but always thought they were just that, stories. Now I'm not so sure. Whatever visited my property that April night in '81 was real, and it was something I can't explain. I reinforced my fences after that and installed more security lights. For months afterward, I'd hear strange noises at night sometimes. Wood knocks in the distance, or that same huffing sound. But they always stopped before I could investigate. By the next year, everything had gone back to normal, and the incident became just another story people on the reservation tell. But I know what I saw in my garden that morning. I know what Tommy saw on the road. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind comes down from the Bear Paw Mountains, I still get that feeling of being watched, and I wonder if it's still out there, whatever it is, moving silently through the mountains and occasionally venturing down to look at us. The experts and scientists can say what they want, but they weren't there. They didn't see those massive 4-toed footprints sunk deep into the soil of my garden. They didn't touch that strange reddish hair or hear those unnatural sounds in the darkness. I don't talk about it much anymore. People off the reservation tend to think you're crazy when you bring up things like this, but I know what happened. And sometimes I still check the fence line for strange hares and look toward the mountains, wondering if I'll ever get answers about what visited us that night. Story 16. I still don't know what the hell I saw that night. It's been 3 months and I can't stop thinking about it. Haven't been camping since, haven't even driven down that road. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I see those eyes in the corner of my bedroom. This happened back in August when I was road tripping through the Pacific Northwest. I'd been living out of my Subaru for about 2 weeks, mostly sleeping at rest stops or Walmart parking lots to save money. After 4 days without a proper shower, I was getting desperate. I smelled like a combination of beef jerky and wet socks. Around 3:30 in the morning, I decided to sneak into this campground I'd passed earlier in the day. It was one of those state parks with shower facilities for campers. My plan was simple: slip in, use the showers, and get out before anyone noticed. Not exactly legal, but I was desperate and figured no one would be awake at that hour anyway. I pulled into the campground around 4 in the morning. The place was dead quiet except for the occasional snore coming from tents and the wind rustling through the trees. The shower building was easy to find, just a concrete structure near the entrance. I parked nearby, grabbed my shower kit, and hurried inside. The shower was amazing. First hot water in days. I spent about 15 minutes just standing there, letting the water run over me. It's crazy how something so simple can feel so good when you've been without it. I remember thinking that even if I got caught, it would have been worth it. After drying off and changing into clean clothes, I snuck back to my car. The sky was still pitch black, and the campground was completely silent. I didn't want to wake anyone up, so I decided not to turn on my headlights until I was back on the main road. I know, stupid move. But I was paranoid about getting caught by a park ranger or something. I slowly crept through the campground, barely going 5 miles per hour. The gravel crunched under my tires, and every sound seemed amplified in the pre-dawn quiet. I kept glancing around, making sure I didn't wake anyone up or attract attention. When I finally reached the exit, I felt relief wash over me. There was a small gatehouse, but obviously no one was staffing it at 4 in the morning. I started to turn onto the main road, still with my headlights off, planning to flip them on once I was completely clear of the campground. That's when it happened. Just as I was completing my turn at the gate, something moved quickly behind my car. I caught it in my rearview mirror, just a flash of pale movement. My first thought was that someone had spotted me and was running after my car, maybe a ranger or an angry camper who'd noticed me sneaking around. I immediately stopped the car. I don't know why I did that, probably should have kept driving, but I was startled, and it was just an instinctive reaction. I shifted into park and turned around to look out my rear window. What I saw didn't make any sense at first. About 15 feet behind my car, partially hidden behind some bushes at the edge of the campground entrance, was what I initially thought was a monkey. I remember thinking, what the hell is a monkey doing here? But even as that thought formed, I knew it wasn't a monkey. It wasn't anything I recognized. The thing had pale skin, not white like a person, but a sickly grayish pale color, like something that had never seen sunlight. It was incredibly thin, like malnourished thin, with weirdly proportioned limbs. Its arms were too long for its body, hanging down near its knees as it leaned forward from behind the bush. But the eyes, Jesus. The eyes are what still haunt me. They were completely black, like 2 holes in its face. Not like normal eyes with whites and pupils, but solid black orbs that seemed to absorb the darkness around them. They were fixed directly on me, unblinking. I couldn't see its legs clearly because of the bushes, but I could tell it was crouched or hunched in some way. It was leaning out, as if curious but also cautious, like it didn't want to fully expose itself. The whole encounter probably lasted only 5 or 6 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. We just stared at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was like my brain was short-circuiting trying to process what I was seeing. Then it shifted slightly, tilting its head in this jerky, unnatural way, and that broke whatever spell had frozen me in place. Pure terror hit me like a physical force. I fumbled with the gear shift, throwing my car into drive, and stomped on the gas so hard that my tires spun on the asphalt before catching. I forgot all about keeping my headlights off. I slammed the switch on, flooding the road ahead with light, and took off down the road as fast as my car would go. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified that the thing was somehow following me. I drove non-stop for almost an hour, not even sure which direction I was heading, just wanting to put as much distance between me and that campground as possible. I finally pulled over at a brightly lit gas station just as dawn was breaking. I sat there in the parking lot with my doors locked, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. My first thought was that I had hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe I was more sleep-deprived than I realized, or maybe I'd eaten something bad, but I knew deep down that wasn't it. I'd seen something real, something that shouldn't exist. I considered going to the police, but what would I even tell them? I was illegally using a campground shower at 4 in the morning and saw some kind of pale, monkey-like creature with black eyes. They'd either think I was on drugs or just write me off as another crazy tourist. After sitting at that gas station for about an hour, watching the sunrise and trying to calm myself down, I decided to look up the campground online. I found a few old newspaper articles about unexplained incidents in that area, mostly hikers going missing or claiming to have seen strange things in the woods. Nothing specific that matched what I saw, but enough to make me feel even more uneasy. I also found some local legends about forest people, or night walkers, that indigenous tribes in the region used to talk about. Beings that weren't quite human, but lived deep in the forests. Most articles dismissed these as just folklore or attributed sightings to bears standing on their hind legs. But what I saw wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else entirely. The rest of my road trip was ruined. I couldn't sleep at night. Every noise outside my car would jolt me awake. I kept thinking I'd see that thing's face peering in through my windows. I ended up cutting my trip short and driving straight home, only stopping when absolutely necessary for gas or to use restrooms. Since coming home, I've spent countless hours researching cryptids and unexplained phenomena. I've found some similar accounts, people describing thin, pale humanoids with oversized black eyes. Some call them crawlers or pale walkers, but none of the descriptions match exactly what I saw. The most disturbing thing is that I can't shake the feeling that it was intelligent, that it was studying me just as much as I was looking at it. There was awareness in those black eyes, and sometimes I wonder if it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. I've told a few close friends about what happened, but I can tell they don't believe me. They humor me, but I see the looks they give each other when they think I'm not watching, like they're worried about my mental health. Maybe they're right to worry. Sometimes I question myself. Did I really see what I think I saw? Was it just an animal that my tired brain misinterpreted? A person with some kind of condition? But then I remember those eyes, that unnaturally thin body, those long arms, and I know it wasn't anything normal. I still have nightmares about it. In my dreams, I don't drive away. In my dreams, it approaches my car, its movements all wrong, like its joints bend in directions they shouldn't. It taps on my window with long, thin fingers, and when I look into those black eyes, I feel like I'm falling into an endless void. I've been thinking about going back to that campground, but in the daylight, with other people. Part of me needs to see if there's any evidence of what I encountered, anything to validate what I experienced. But another part of me is terrified of what I might find, or what might find me. I don't know what it was, or if I'll ever understand what happened that night. All I know is that I saw something that shouldn't exist, something that doesn't fit into the world as I understood it. And now I can't stop looking over my shoulder, especially at night. I can't stop wondering if there are more of them out there, watching from the shadows. And sometimes, when I'm driving at night and catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, my heart stops for a second, and I'm back at that campground, staring into those soulless black eyes. Story 17. This happened in the summer of 1994, and I swear I haven't been able to shake it since. My buddy and I had been planning this trip for months. We had a small gold claim at the top of Madison Gulch near Lincoln, Montana. We called it Grandbaby's Mining Co. Nothing fancy, just a little spot where we'd pan for gold on weekends. It wasn't about getting rich, more about getting away from everything and everyone. The morning started like any other camping trip. We'd driven up the previous evening, set up our small camp about half a mile from our claim, and crashed early. I remember waking up to the sound of birds and that crisp mountain air that hits your lungs differently than city air. The sun was just coming up over the ridge, making everything look golden. Perfect day for finding gold, my buddy had said while we cooked breakfast over our little campfire. He wasn't wrong. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, not too hot yet, but something felt off to me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I had this weird sensation crawling up my spine whenever I turned my back to the tree line. After breakfast, we gathered our gear, pans, shovels, a couple of classifiers and some snacks, and hiked up to our claim. It was about a 20-minute walk from our campsite, following the creek most of the way. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, maybe just nerves from being out in the wilderness. "You all right?" my buddy asked, noticing me scanning the trees for the third or fourth time. "Yeah, just thought I heard something," I lied. I didn't want to sound paranoid. We'd been coming to these woods for years, and I'd never felt like this before. When we reached our claim, we split up as usual. He preferred working down by the creek bed, where the water was easier to access for panning. I liked working the hillside, checking the soil for any signs of gold that might have washed down over time. The feeling of being watched grew stronger as the morning wore on. By midday, it was driving me crazy. I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I'd turn to look, there'd be nothing there. Just trees swaying in the light breeze. I was about 50 yards up the hillside from the creek, digging into what looked like a promising spot when it happened. I had just straightened up to stretch my back when I saw it. About 100 feet away, partially obscured by a cluster of pines, was something. My first thought was bear, but no, this thing was standing upright, completely upright, like a person, but much bigger. It was dark, not black, but a deep dark brown, and covered in what looked like hair or fur. I couldn't make out facial features clearly from that distance, but I could tell it was looking right at me. My heart felt like it stopped. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, shovel in hand, staring, and it stared back. The weirdest part? It didn't seem aggressive. It didn't growl or make any threatening moves. If anything, it seemed curious, surprised even, like it hadn't expected to see me there any more than I had expected to see it. I don't know how long we stood there looking at each other. Could have been 10 seconds or 2 minutes. Time sort of lost meaning. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned and walked into the denser part of the forest. Not running, not charging, just walking away. The way it moved was so fluid, so natural, nothing like a person in a costume would move. I wanted to call out to my buddy, but my voice was stuck in my throat, and honestly I was afraid that if I made a sound the creature might come back, or worse, it might disappear and I'd never know for sure what I saw. Once it was gone, I sank to my knees. My legs were shaking so bad I couldn't stand. I kept staring at the spot where it had been, half expecting it to reappear, half hoping it wouldn't. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally got up the nerve to move again. My buddy was still down by the creek, completely oblivious to what had just happened. I could hear him humming some country song as he worked his pan in the water. I thought about going down to tell him, but something held me back. What would I say? Hey, I just saw Bigfoot? He'd think I was joking or had been out in the sun too long. Plus, part of me was worried that talking about it would somehow make it less real, or that saying it out loud would make me sound crazy. So I picked up my shovel and tried to keep working, but I couldn't focus. My hands were shaking, and I kept looking over at the trees where the creature had disappeared. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. It wasn't until later that I remembered something strange from the day before. We had hiked further up the gulch, past our claim, just exploring. There was this moment when we both stopped in our tracks, hit by the most god-awful smell. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled before. Not a dead animal, not human waste, just rancid, like rotting meat mixed with wet fur and something else I couldn't identify. It came in waves, strong 1 minute, gone the next. "What the hell is that?" my buddy had asked, covering his nose with his bandana. "Bear, maybe?" I suggested. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. I've smelled bear before. This was different. The smell followed us for about a quarter mile until we reached this old, abandoned one-room log cabin. It was barely standing, roof half caved in, probably built by some hopeful miner decades ago. The smell was strongest there, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone as we headed back down toward our camp. Sitting on that hillside after seeing the creature, I made the connection. That smell, that feeling of being watched, it all made sense now. Whatever I had just seen had been tracking us, following us, watching us from the moment we entered its territory. I tried to act normal for the rest of the day. When my buddy asked why I was so quiet, I blamed it on a headache from the sun. We packed up our gear around 4 in the afternoon and headed back to camp. The whole way back, I kept scanning the trees, jumping at every sound. That night at the campfire, I almost told him. I got as far as, "Hey, you ever hear stories about Bigfoot in these parts?" But the look he gave me, like I was setting up for some dumb joke, made me change course. Never mind, just something I read online before we came out here. We turned in early that night. He fell asleep right away, but I lay there in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, listening. The normal night sounds of the forest seemed amplified. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling of our tent. Around midnight, the sounds stopped, all of them. The forest went completely silent, like everything was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. Not an animal on 4 legs, something walking upright. I wanted to wake my buddy, but fear had me paralyzed. The footsteps circled twice, then stopped near the entrance to our tent. I could hear breathing, deep, rhythmic breathing, not angry or aggressive, just there, watching, waiting. I must have eventually fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. My buddy was already up, boiling water for coffee. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied. "You?" "Like a log, ready to find some gold today." I wasn't. What I was ready for was to pack up and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't explain why without telling him everything, and I still wasn't ready for that conversation. So we spent another day at the claim. I stayed closer to him this time, down by the creek. I didn't see the creature again, but the feeling of being watched never left. We left the next morning, a day earlier than planned. I made up some excuse about forgetting I had a commitment back in town. My buddy was disappointed, but didn't argue. It's been years now, and I've never told anyone the full story until now. I've gone back and forth 1,000 times about what I saw. Was it really a Bigfoot, some undiscovered species? A bear with mange standing on its hind legs, but deep down I know what I saw. It was intelligent, it was aware, and it knew I had seen it. I've never gone back to that claim. My buddy asked a few times, but I always had an excuse. Eventually, he found another partner to go with him. They never experienced anything strange, or if they did, he never mentioned it to me. Sometimes I dream about it. Those eyes watching me from the trees, that massive figure walking with such strange grace. I wake up sweating, the smell of rotting meat and wet fur in my nostrils, though I know it's just my memory playing tricks. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. Something was out there in those woods, something that wasn't supposed to exist. Something that was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it remembers me too. If it tells its family about the strange little human it saw digging in the dirt that summer day, looking for shiny rocks and finding something else entirely. Story 18. I'm still shaken about what happened last summer. I don't talk about it much because people either think I'm crazy or they laugh it off. But I know what I saw. My husband, my daughter and I all saw it. Clear as day. We had been planning this vacation to the mountains for months. Nothing fancy, just a small cabin rental near the National Forest in northern Washington. We're from Portland, so it was only about a 4-hour drive. But it felt like we were a world away from everything. No cell service, spotty internet at the cabin at best, and miles of forest surrounding us. It was exactly what we needed after the stress of the past year. It was our 3rd day at the cabin. The first 2 days were spent hiking shorter trails and exploring the small town about 20 minutes away. That day, Thursday, we decided to take it easy. We slept in, made a big breakfast and just lounged around reading and playing board games. Around 6 in the evening, my husband Mike suggested we drive up to this lookout point the cabin owner had told us about. Apparently, it had incredible sunset views over the valley. The lookout was about 15 minutes from our cabin on this winding mountain road, not particularly remote by local standards, but definitely secluded to us city folks. The entire drive there, we had forest on both sides of us, occasionally opening to reveal breathtaking views of the mountains in the distance. My 12-year-old daughter, Emma, was sitting in the back seat, face pressed against the window, watching the trees go by. I was in the passenger seat, checking the directions the owner had scribbled on a piece of paper. The sun was still up, but starting to get that golden evening glow that photographers call the magic hour. We were maybe 10 minutes into the drive when Emma suddenly said, "Mom, what's that?" Her voice had this strange edge to it that immediately made me look up. "What's what, honey?" I asked, turning to look out her window. "By the trees, standing there. Look." Mike slowed the car down and we all peered out to where Emma was pointing. The road curved slightly to the right up ahead, and where the pavement met the tree line on the left side, there was something. At first, I thought it might be a tree stump, or maybe even a bear standing on its hind legs. But as we got closer, driving maybe 20 miles an hour now, I realized it was neither. It was a figure, tall, incredibly tall. It was standing partially turned away from us, so we could see its left shoulder and back clearly. The proportions were unmistakably humanoid: a head, shoulders, torso, arms. But the size was all wrong. It had to be between 8 and 10 feet tall. I'm not exaggerating. Mike is 6'3", and this thing would have towered over him. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, slowing the car to almost a crawl. The figure was covered in hair, not fur like a bear, but hair, light brown or tan in color. It didn't look smooth like a horse or dog's coat. It was coarse, almost shaggy in appearance. I remember thinking how the hair on its back seemed to catch the sunlight in an unusual way, giving it almost a golden hue at the edges. We had a completely unobstructed view. There wasn't any brush or trees between us and it. It was just standing there at the edge of the forest, maybe 20 yards from the road. The outline was solid against the darker backdrop of the trees. This wasn't a trick of the light or a shadow. Dad, is that... Emma started, but didn't finish her sentence. The figure didn't move much. Just a slight shift of weight, maybe. It maintained roughly the same pose the entire time we watched it. I don't think it ever turned to look at us directly, but I got the distinct impression it knew we were there. For about 10 seconds, none of us said anything. We just stared. The car had slowed to maybe 5 miles per hour. I had this overwhelming urge to tell Mike to stop the car so I could see it better, but another part of me, a more primal part, was screaming to keep moving. "Keep driving," I finally said, my voice barely audible. Mike pressed the gas, and we accelerated past the figure. I twisted in my seat to keep looking until we rounded the bend, and it disappeared from view. "Did you guys see that?" Emma asked, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. "Yeah," Mike said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I saw it." "That wasn't a person," I said. "It couldn't have been." "It was too big," Emma agreed. "And did you see how it was just standing there? No clothes or anything." She was right. There had been no sign of human clothing or equipment, no backpack, no hiking gear, nothing that would indicate it was a human in a costume or even an unusually tall hiker. We continued to the lookout point in a sort of daze. Mike kept checking the rearview mirror, and I found myself scanning the tree line as we drove. The lookout was beautiful. A small clearing with a stunning view of the valley below and the mountains beyond. Under normal circumstances, we would have been taking dozens of photos and enjoying the sunset colors. Instead, we stood close together, speaking in hushed tones about what we'd seen. "Could it have been a bear?" Mike suggested, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe that himself. "Bears don't stand like that," I said, "and it didn't move like an animal. It was just standing there, like a person." "But it was so tall," Emma said, "and hairy all over." We stayed at the lookout for about half an hour, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The beautiful sunset barely registered. My mind was too busy replaying those 10 seconds over and over. The way it stood, the color and texture of the hair, the impossible height as the sky darkened, an uneasy feeling settled over us. The forest that had seemed so peaceful and inviting that morning now felt ominous. Every rustle in the nearby bushes made me jump. "We should head back," Mike finally said, as the last light faded from the sky. No one argued. The drive back felt much longer than 15 minutes. We had to pass that same spot again, and I found myself holding my breath as we approached the curve in the road. Emma was silent in the back seat, but I could see her wide eyes in the side mirror, scanning the tree line just as intently as I was. When we reached the spot, about 45 minutes after we'd first passed it, there was nothing there. Mike slowed the car and we all stared at the place where the figure had been standing. The clearing was empty. The road was undisturbed. There was no sign that anything had ever been there. "It's gone," Emma said, sounding both relieved and disappointed. Mike stopped the car completely, and we sat there for a moment, headlights illuminating the edge of the forest. I half expected to see a pair of eyes reflecting back at us from between the trees, but there was nothing. "Should we get out and look?" Emma asked. "Absolutely not," Mike and I said simultaneously. There was no way I was setting foot outside that car. The rational part of my brain kept trying to come up with explanations. It was just a tall hiker taking a break, or maybe some kind of optical illusion caused by the evening light and tree shadows. But I knew those explanations were inadequate. What we saw had been solid, distinct, and unnaturally large. Mike put the car in drive, and we continued back to our cabin. We were all unusually quiet for the rest of the evening. After Emma went to bed, Mike and I sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea that went cold as we talked in low voices. "I've never believed in that stuff," Mike said, running his hands through his hair. "Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. It always seemed like nonsense to me." "Me too," I admitted. "But what else could it have been? You saw how tall it was." "I know. And the way it was just standing there, watching the forest, like it belonged there." We didn't sleep much that night. I kept getting up to check that the doors were locked, pulling back the curtains to peer into the darkness surrounding our little cabin. The next morning, we decided to cut our vacation short. We packed up and were on the road by 9, making excuses to Emma about a work emergency that required us to go home early. On the drive back, we passed that spot again in broad daylight. It looked so ordinary, just a small clearing where the forest edge met the road, nothing unusual or remarkable about it, but I couldn't help slowing down as we passed, scanning the tree line for any sign of what we'd seen. It's been months now, and I still think about it almost daily. I've done research, read accounts of similar sightings in the area, even joined some online forums where people discuss their experiences. Some of the descriptions match what we saw so closely, it gives me chills. Mike doesn't like to talk about it anymore. He's gone back to his skeptical self, suggesting it might have been a hiker with unusually proportioned clothes, or even a large piece of equipment covered with a tarp that looked like a figure from a distance. But his explanations feel forced, like he's trying to convince himself more than me. Emma, on the other hand, is fascinated. She's been checking out books from the library, watching documentaries. "We saw a Sasquatch, Mom," she tells me with absolute certainty. "We're lucky." I don't know if lucky is the right word. What I do know is that for those 10 seconds, we saw something that shouldn't exist according to everything I've been taught to believe. Something that was both human-like and not human at all. Something ancient and wild that made me feel like we were the intruders, not it. I still haven't told many people about what happened. I'm not interested in being mocked or having people try to explain away what I know I saw. But I needed to write it down, to put it somewhere outside my own head. Because no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the image of that tall, hair-covered figure standing at the edge of the forest, so still and yet so alive, like it was part of the wilderness itself. I don't know what it was, but I know what I saw. And some nights, I still wake up wondering if, as we drove away, it turned to watch us go.